Hello and welcome to this delightful, clean, historical Western romance by Shelfie audiobook. We're thrilled to have you join us. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Your support in these small ways helps us bring you more heartwarming romance stories at no cost. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away into a world of adventure, love, and unforgettable characters. Enjoy! This audiobook is copyrighted by Shelfie Bennett. Chapter 1. A Desperate Arrangement. I watched the pancake batter bubble and darken at the edges, knowing I ought to flip it, but my attention kept straying to the mantel clock, ticking away the precious minutes until the children would be late for school again. The ranch kitchen, once the heart of our home, had become a battleground where I faced daily defeat. "Pa, it's burning," Jacob's accusatory voice snapped me back to the smoking skillet. I flipped the flapjack to reveal a charred underside, adding it to the stack of similarly blackened offerings. The scent of scorched flour hung heavy in the air, mingling with the lingering aroma of this morning's overboiled coffee. "Dadgummit," I muttered, then caught myself. "I mean, it ain't so bad. Just scrape the black part off." Timothy, my youngest at just 4 years old, knelt on his chair, reaching for the milk pitcher with pudgy fingers. "I can pour my own," he insisted, though experience should have taught us all otherwise. Before I could intervene, the pitcher tilted too far. Milk cascaded across the worn tablecloth, forming tributaries that flowed into Jacob's lap and onto the plank floor below. "Consarn it, Timmy!" Jacob hollered, jumping to his feet. At 7 years old, he possessed a flair for the dramatic that would have made his mother smile. Now it just added to the morning chaos. "These are my only clean breeches!" I pressed my fingers against my throbbing temples. "Jacob, mind your tongue." A soft rustling of skirts caught my attention. Sarah, my eldest at 10, had already slipped from her seat and retrieved the dish rag. Silent as always, she dabbed at the spill, her movements efficient but mechanical. Her golden braids hung limply over her shoulders, tied with faded ribbons that hadn't been changed in days. Not a word had passed her lips in the 2 years since Rebecca's passing, as if her voice had been buried alongside her mother. The sight of her, so like Rebecca in profile but so unlike her in spirit, twisted something in my chest. A child her age shouldn't move with such weariness, shouldn't have to be the woman of the house. "Sarah, honey, I'll do that." I reached for the rag, but she shook her head once, firmly, and continued cleaning. Her eyes, so like her mother's, remained fixed on her task, avoiding mine as they always did these days. I slid the last burnt pancake onto Jacob's plate. "Eat up, you'll be late." "These are hard as bark," Jacob complained, poking at his breakfast. "Then eat your bark, like a good beaver," I replied, attempting humor that fell as flat as my flapjacks. "There's molasses!" Timothy giggled at that, at least, drizzling a small lake of sticky sweetness onto his plate. Sarah ate mechanically, taking tiny bites, scraping away the worst of the charring without complaint. The clock chimed 8, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Saddle up, you two," I told Jacob and Sarah. "Got your books, your lunch pails?" Sarah nodded, rising to collect the tin pails I'd packed the night before, stale bread and apple butter. The best I could manage. She handed one to Jacob, who took it with a grimace, then headed for the door without meeting my gaze. "Sarah," I called after her. She paused, her narrow shoulders stiffening beneath her too small dress. Your hair ribbon's coming loose." She reached up to touch it, then shrugged slightly before slipping outside. That shrug cut deeper than any words could have. It said plainly enough, "What does it matter?" Once the older two were gone, I turned to find Timothy had created a molasses masterpiece across the table. "Blazes, son," I sighed, too tired to even work up proper anger. "I made a picture," he explained seriously. "It's Ranger." The sticky brown lines did bear some resemblance to our old cattle dog, if you squinted hard enough. "Fine artwork," I said, ruffling his unruly curls. "But now we've got to clean it before the flies throw a party." As I wiped up the table with one hand and held Timothy's sticky fingers away with the other, I spotted an envelope that must have been delivered while I was in the barn earlier. Setting Timothy down with a carved wooden horse, I tore open the letter, immediately recognizing Mrs. Hodges' precise handwriting. My stomach sank as I read, Mr. Blackwell, it is with regret that I must tender my immediate resignation from my position as housekeeper at your ranch. My sister in Denver has fallen gravely ill and requires my care. I have already departed on the morning stage. I have left the house in as good order as possible, given the circumstances. Respectfully, Mrs. Agatha Hodges. I crushed the paper in my fist, allowing myself one colorful curse before remembering Timothy's attentive ears. Mrs. Hodges had only come 3 days a week to begin with, barely keeping the place from falling into complete disarray. But now, with calving season approaching and 100 head needing my constant attention, Timothy, we need to go to town, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Can I ride up front with you? His blue eyes, Rebecca's eyes, widened hopefully. Not today, son. Miss Fanny at the Mercantile will watch you while I tend to business. I couldn't drag a 4-year-old through my desperate search for help. Timothy's lower lip trembled. Don't like Miss Fanny. She smells like medicine. She gives you peppermint sticks? I reminded him, already calculating how many errands I could squeeze into an hour before Timothy wore out his welcome with the elderly shopkeeper. Pinecrest was hardly more than a wide spot in the trail, a couple dozen buildings clustered around a dusty main street, with the newly constructed railroad station standing proudly at the north end. Still, it was the center of commerce for ranchers and farmers spread across 50 miles of Montana territory. I hitched the wagon outside Donovan's general store, lifting Timothy down and straightening his collar before ushering him inside. The bell above the door jingled merrily, announcing our arrival to Miss Fanny, who peered over her spectacles from behind the counter. Well, if it isn't the Blackwell men, she said, her wrinkled face creasing into a smile. Timothy, I believe I have a fresh batch of peppermint sticks that need inspecting. Timothy's earlier reluctance vanished as he scampered toward the glass jar on the counter. I mouthed a silent thank you to Miss Fanny before addressing her nephew, who was stacking crates near the back. Matthew? Didn't expect to find you here. Matthew Wilkes straightened, his familiar grin spreading across his tanned face. We'd grown up neighboring ranches, thick as thieves, until he'd left for the East 10 years ago to seek his fortune. He'd returned last fall to help his aging aunt with the store. Elijah Blackwell, he said, extending a hand. You look like you've been dragged behind a wild Mustang. I clasped his hand, managing a weak smile. Feel worse than that. Matthew's eyes, always too observant, took in my wrinkled shirt, the shadows beneath my eyes. Something troubling you? I glanced toward Timothy, now happily occupied with his candy, while Miss Fanny showed him a picture book. More than usual, I admitted quietly. Mrs. Hodges quit without warning, left a note saying her sister's ill in Denver. That's rough timing with calving season coming on, Matthew said, understanding immediately the predicament of a rancher with no woman to tend the house and children. Don't know what I'm going to do, I confessed, the words scraping my pride raw. Can't manage the ranch and the young'uns both. Been barely hanging on as it is. Matthew leaned against a barrel of flour, considering. You know, my sister Grace is looking to leave Boston. Had a broken engagement that's left her wanting a fresh start. I vaguely recalled Matthew mentioning a sister in his letters over the years. She looking for work? She's been teaching at a ladies' seminary, Matthew said. But the thing is, Elijah, I've been hearing talk. My spine stiffened. What kind of talk? Matthew had the decency to look uncomfortable. Just concerns about the children, how they're faring without a mother's touch. Mrs. Prescott has been particularly vocal since Sunday services when she noticed Sarah's dress was missing buttons. Heat crawled up my neck. The children are fed and clothed. They get to school. I know that, Matthew said quickly, but others are wondering if a widower can manage alone. There's been talk of the Ladies' Aid Society calling on the territorial authorities if things don't improve. Ice replaced the heat in my veins. They'd take my children? Not if you had a wife, Matthew said carefully, or someone who appeared to be your wife. I stared at him, uncomprehending at first. Then his meaning dawned. Your sister. You can't be serious. It wouldn't be real, Matthew rushed to explain. Just an arrangement until harvest. Grace poses as Mrs. Blackwell, helps with the children and the house. You maintain your standing in the community and get through calving season. By fall, she moves on to California like she's planning, and you've had time to make proper arrangements. The idea was preposterous, scandalous even, yet the alternative, losing my children, was unthinkable. She'd never agree to such a thing, I said. Let me write to her, Matthew insisted. Grace has always had a soft heart, especially for children, and she's looking for a place to stay until the school term in San Francisco begins in the fall. Pride warred with desperation inside me. Finally, desperation won. I'd pay her fair wages, I said stiffly, and she'd have her own quarters, naturally. I'll write this afternoon, Matthew promised. You can add your own words if you like. Later, with Timothy napping in the wagon, I sat at Matthew's desk in the room behind the store, staring at the letter he'd drafted. The arrangement, laid out in Matthew's careful handwriting, sounded both reasonable and ridiculous by turns. My dear sister, I write with an unusual proposition that may provide the fresh beginning you seek, while helping a good friend in dire circumstances. At the bottom, I added my own postscript. Miss Wilkes, I understand this is an unconventional request. Please know I offer fair compensation, separate quarters, and my word as a gentleman that your reputation will be protected. My children desperately need a woman's care, and I find myself unable to provide it while keeping our ranch afloat. Your help would be most appreciated, if only until harvest time. Respectfully, Elijah Blackwell. As I signed my name, I wondered what Rebecca would think of this desperate scheme. Would she understand, or would she see it as a betrayal of her memory? Folding the letter, I handed it to Matthew, feeling as though I'd just made a deal with either Providence or the devil, and I wasn't sure which. The day had grown long by the time I turned the wagon down our rutted drive. Timothy had fallen asleep against my shoulder, his breath warm and sticky with peppermint against my neck. The setting sun cast long shadows across the pasture where my cattle grazed, oblivious to the turmoil of their owner. Smoke curled from the chimney, which struck me as odd. I hadn't left a fire burning. Alarm quickened my pulse as I urged the horses faster. Setting the brake, I gathered Timothy in one arm and rushed toward the house. The acrid smell of burning hit me before I'd even opened the door. Inside, smoke hung in a thin haze near the ceiling. I followed it to the kitchen, where Sarah stood on a chair before the stove, frantically trying to move a cast-iron skillet that was belching black smoke. "Sarah!" I shouted, setting Timothy down. I lunged forward, grabbing her around the waist and pulling her away just as flames licked up from whatever was charring in the pan. With my free hand, I seized the cloth hanging from the oven door and used it to move the skillet to the wash basin, where it hissed and steamed upon contact with the dishwater. Sarah trembled in my arms, her face smudged with soot. For a moment, I held her close, my heart hammering against my ribs as I imagined what might have happened had I been delayed in town. "What were you thinking?" I asked, setting her down but keeping my hands on her thin shoulders. "You know you're not to touch the stove without an adult." Her eyes, wide with fright, filled with tears. She pointed at the table, where 3 plates had been set out, each with a napkin folded beside it. Then she gestured toward the ruined pan, which I now saw contained the blackened remains of what might have been eggs. "You were trying to make supper," I realized, my anger dissolving into a hollow ache. My 10-year-old daughter had been attempting to do a grown woman's work because I'd failed to provide one. Sarah nodded, a tear tracking through the soot on her cheek. "I'm not angry," I said softly, wiping the tear away with my thumb. "Just scared. You could have been hurt." She looked down, shoulders slumping. I recognized the defeat in that posture because I felt it myself most days. "Let's get you cleaned up," I said gently. "Then we'll rustle up some cold supper." Later, after a simple meal of bread and canned peaches, I tucked the children into their beds. Timothy fell asleep mid-prayer, his hands still folded beneath his chin. Jacob extracted a promise of fresh clothes for tomorrow before drifting off. But Sarah lay awake, watching me with solemn eyes that seemed to hold me accountable for all I couldn't provide. "Try to sleep, darlin'," I whispered, smoothing her hair. "Things will get better." She turned away, curling into herself, and I felt the gulf between us widen another inch. Alone in the hallway, I paused before the small table where Rebecca's portrait sat in a silver frame, her wedding gift from my mother. In the lamplight, her painted eyes seemed to follow me, questioning my decisions, measuring my failures. I sank to my knees before the portrait, something I hadn't done since the day we laid her in the cold ground. Prayer had seemed pointless then. God had taken my Rebecca, leaving me with 3 children and a heart so hollow I could hear the wind whistle through it. "Lord," I whispered, the word rusty from disuse, "I don't know if you're listening, but I'm at the end of my rope here. These children deserve better than what I can give them alone." My throat tightened around the words. I need help. They need help. If this arrangement with Miss Wilkes is wrong, show me another way. But don't let my pride cost my children their home. I lifted Rebecca's portrait, tracing the curve of her painted cheek with my thumb. "Rebecca, forgive me," I murmured. "I know this ain't what we planned. But I swear it's just temporary, just to keep our family together. Just to keep our family together. Just until I can find my footing again." The house creaked and settled around me, as empty of answers as it was of a woman's touch. I set the portrait down, rose on weary legs, and made my way to my cold and empty bed, wondering what kind of woman would agree to such a desperate arrangement, and whether she could possibly be the answer to a prayer I'd only just found the courage to speak. Chapter 2: The Schoolteacher Arrives. I descended from the stagecoach with legs so stiff they nearly betrayed me on the first step. Only pride kept my spine straight as I placed my boot firmly on Montana soil and surveyed the town of Pinecrest for the first time. After 3 days of being jostled over rutted roads, breathing dust and the mingled odors of my fellow travelers, I longed for nothing more than a hot bath in a soft bed. Instead, I found myself blinking in the bright April sunshine, taking in a sight both foreign and oddly compelling. Pinecrest nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains that pierced the sky like cathedral spires. Their snow-capped peaks gleamed against a heaven so intensely blue it made my eyes water. Or perhaps that was just the dust. "Grace, over here!" I turned to see my brother Matthew waving from beside a weathered farm wagon. His familiar face, now tanned and lined from Montana living, broke into a wide grin that momentarily erased the 7 years since I'd seen him last. "Matthew," I said, relief washing through me as I moved toward him, mindful of the curious stares from loungers outside the general store. A lady traveling alone attracted enough attention without appearing overly enthusiastic. He caught me in a bear hug that lifted me clean off my feet, propriety be damned. "Look at you," he said, setting me down, but keeping his hands on my shoulders. "Still as prim as a schoolmarm, but you made it all the way out here. I'm proud of you, Gracie." I smoothed my travel-rumpled skirts, grateful I'd changed into my serviceable navy wool at the last station. "The journey was educational," I offered diplomatically. Matthew laughed. "I reckon that's one word for it." His expression sobered as he glanced toward the baggage being unloaded. "Which ones are yours?" I pointed to my 2 trunks, one containing clothes, the other books and teaching materials. "Just those, the large one's quite heavy, I'm afraid." "Books, no doubt?" he said with the indulgent smile he'd worn since we were children and he'd caught me reading by candlelight past midnight. As Matthew arranged with the driver to bring my trunks to the wagon, I took in the single, dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. Pinecrest was a far cry from Boston's cobbled streets and brick townhouses. Here, everything appeared provisional somehow, as if the entire town might simply fold up and disappear at a strong wind's urging. "Not much to look at, is it?" Matthew said, returning to my side. "It's frontier charm personified," I replied, drawing a chuckle from him. "Still using $10 words when 5-cent ones would do?" He offered his arm. "Come on, we'll get your things loaded, then head straight out to the Blackwell place." My stomach tightened at the mention of our destination. Shouldn't we stop at your aunt's first? I'd like to freshen up before meeting Mr. Blackwell and his children." Matthew's smile faded, concern creasing his brow. "Best to get you settled before nightfall. It's a fair piece out to Elijah's ranch." As we supervised the loading of my trunks, I noticed Matthew casting worried glances my way. Once we were seated in the wagon, Boston leather beside me and Matthew flicking the reins to start the horses, he finally spoke what was on his mind. "Grace, there's more to Elijah's situation than I wrote in my letter." The wagon lurched forward and I gripped the seat. "What do you mean?" Matthew kept his eyes on the road as we left Pinecrest behind, the buildings growing smaller in the vast landscape. "Things at the ranch are worse than I let on. Elijah's proud. Wouldn't want you knowing the full extent of it." "Extent of what, exactly?" I pressed, unease growing within me. Matthew sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Since Rebecca died, he's been drowning. The ranch is barely hanging on. The house is, well, it needs a woman's touch, something fierce. And the children—" He trailed off, looking troubled. "You mentioned 3 children," I prompted. "Sarah's 10, smart as a whip, but hasn't spoken a word since her mama passed 2 years ago. Jacob's 7, angry at the world. And little Timothy's just 4, hardly remembers his mother at all." He glanced at me. "They're good children, Grace, but they're hurting." I swallowed hard, picturing these wounded young souls. "And Mr. Blackwell? What of him?" "Elijah works himself half to death trying to keep it all going. Proud man, Gracie. It nearly killed him to agree to this arrangement." The landscape opened before us, rolling hills giving way to pasture land, dotted with grazing cattle. In the distance, a creek twisted like a silver ribbon through stands of cottonwoods just beginning to bud with spring's promise. "The letter mentioned I would pose as his wife," I said carefully. "In town only, I presume?" Matthew nodded. "The ladies of Pinecrest have been making noises about the children's welfare. One whiff of unmarried female living under Elijah's roof and they'd have the territorial authorities out there quicker than greased lightning." "So we're deceiving the entire community," I said, unable to keep disapproval from my tone. "We're protecting 3 innocent children," Matthew countered gently. "Sometimes the good Lord understands that circumstances require creative solutions." I fell silent, contemplating this justification against my strict Boston upbringing. Finally, I asked, "Does he truly not have any other option? He's tried hiring housekeepers, but none stay. It's too much work for one woman and too remote for most. The last one left without notice when calving season hit." Matthew's voice softened. "I wouldn't have suggested this if I thought there was another way, Gracie. Or if I thought you'd be in any danger." The wagon rolled over a rise and suddenly a homestead appeared in the valley below. A 2-story frame house, a large barn, and several outbuildings nestled against a backdrop of distant mountains. "There it is," Matthew said. "Blackwell Ranch." As we drew closer, the romantic vision faded into stark reality. What had likely once been a handsome home now showed clear signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the clapboards, shutters hung askew on several windows, and last autumn's dead leaves still cluttered the yard. A clothesline sagged between 2 posts, forgotten laundry flapping like pale ghosts in the afternoon breeze. The garden beds, which might have burst with spring plantings by now, lay choked with weeds. Only a few hardy daffodils pushed golden heads through the tangle, defiant reminders of a more tended time. My heart sank. This wasn't just a household needing a feminine touch. This was a home in distress, a visible manifestation of grief unprocessed. As the wagon wheels crunched on the gravel drive, the front door opened. A tall man stepped onto the porch, hat in hand. Even at a distance, I recognized the cautious, wary posture of someone preparing to be judged and found wanting. "That's Elijah," Matthew murmured unnecessarily. The wagon halted before the house, and Matthew jumped down to help me alight. As my feet touched ground, I finally got a clear look at the man I'd agreed to temporarily marry. Elijah Blackwell was nothing like the carefree boy I vaguely remembered from childhood visits to my grandparents' neighboring ranch. That boy's easy smile and laughing eyes, had been replaced by a man whose weathered face spoke of hard years and harder losses. His dark hair, overly long and threaded with silver at the temples, framed features that might have been handsome had they not been so strained. Only his eyes remained familiar, the same deep blue as the Montana sky, though now shadowed with weariness. "Miss Wilkes," he said, nodding formally. His voice was deeper than I expected, rough-edged, like he didn't use it often enough. "Mr. Blackwell," I replied, forcing steadiness into my own voice. "Thank you for having me." He shifted uncomfortably, his calloused hands turning the hat brim. "Matthew explained the arrangement?" "Yes, quite thoroughly on our ride here." An awkward silence fell, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. Matthew cleared his throat. "I'll get those trunks onto the porch for you, Elijah." "I'll help," Elijah said quickly, as if relieved to have a task that didn't involve conversation. As the men unloaded my belongings, I took the opportunity to study the house more closely. Despite its neglected exterior, the structure itself appeared sound. With effort and care, it could be restored to its former beauty. The men set my trunks on the porch, and Matthew wiped his brow. "Well, I'd best get back to town before Miss Fanny sends a search party." He gave me a quick, encouraging hug. "You'll do fine, Gracie. These are good people." "You're leaving already?" I couldn't keep the note of alarm from my voice. "Got the store to mind," he said apologetically. "I'll be out again on Sunday." Before I could formulate another protest, the front door burst open and a small tornado in the form of a tow-headed boy barreled onto the porch. "Is that her? Is that her?" he demanded, skidding to a stop before me, eyes wide with curiosity. "Timothy," Elijah admonished, "mind your manners." The child ignored him, tilting his head to study me with unabashed interest. "Are you our new mama?" he asked bluntly. My breath caught. Matthew's hasty farewell faded into background as I met the hopeful gaze of this small boy. Behind him, 2 more children had appeared in the doorway. A lanky boy with a mutinous expression and a thin girl with solemn eyes and blonde braids. "Timothy, Miss Wilkes is here to help us for a while," Elijah said carefully. "She isn't your new mama." Timothy's face fell momentarily before brightening again. "But she's going to live with us? And cook? And read stories?" I found my voice at last. "I'd be happy to read stories," I offered, kneeling to his level. "I'm Miss Grace, and you must be Timothy." He nodded vigorously. "I'm 4, he announced, holding up 4 pudgy fingers. "A very fine age," I said solemnly. Matthew used this moment to make his escape, calling promises to visit soon as he climbed into the wagon and flicked the reins. The horses pulled away, wagon wheels crunching on gravel, leaving me with 4 strangers who were now, according to our fiction, my family. Elijah cleared his throat. "You've met Timothy. This here's Jacob," he said, gesturing to the older boy, who scowled and looked away, and Sarah. The girl stared at me with unblinking blue eyes, her face a careful blank. "I'm very pleased to meet all of you," I said, rising to my feet again. "Children, Miss Wilkes has had a long journey. Let's let her get settled before supper," Elijah instructed. To me, he added awkwardly, "I'll show you your room." Timothy immediately grabbed my hand. "I can show her, I know where it is." "Timothy," Elijah began, but I interjected. "I'd be delighted to have such a capable guide." The boy beamed, tugging me toward the door. Jacob scowled harder, if that was possible, while Sarah silently stepped aside to let us pass. The interior of the house told a similar story of neglect, though efforts had clearly been made to tidy up for my arrival. The parlor furnishings were good quality, but dusty, with books and children's toys hastily shoved onto shelves. The rag rugs needed beating, and the curtains hung limp and faded. Timothy pulled me up a staircase to a small room off the main hallway. "This is your room," he announced proudly. The space had obviously been a sewing room before my arrival. A narrow bed had been wedged along one wall, with a small dresser and washstand beside it. A braided rug covered part of the wooden floor, and lace curtains softened the single window. Despite its hasty conversion, someone had made an effort to make it welcoming. A small vase of the daffodils I'd noticed outside sat on the windowsill. Sarah picked the flowers, Timothy volunteered, as if reading my thoughts. Pa said to make it nice. Elijah appeared in the doorway, my smaller trunk in his arms. It ain't much, he said, setting it down. The sewing room was all we had that wasn't being used. It's perfectly adequate, I assured him. Thank you. He nodded, clearly uncomfortable. I'll bring the other trunk up momentarily. Timothy, go wash up for supper. The boy disappeared reluctantly, after extracting a promise that I would sit beside him at the table. Alone with Elijah for the first time, I found the silence stretching uncomfortably between us. Mr. Blackwell, I began, I think we should discuss the particulars of our arrangement. Course, he said, leaning against the doorframe, keeping a proper distance. You'll care for the children and the house. In town, you'll be introduced as Mrs. Blackwell, but here, he cleared his throat, here, things will be proper. You'll have your privacy. I spend most daylight hours with the herd or in the fields anyway. And the children? What do they understand of this situation? He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Timothy's too young to grasp it. Jacob knows you're hired help, though he's been told to call you Miss Grace in private, Mrs. Blackwell in public. Sarah? He faltered. Sarah understands more than she lets on. I nodded, processing this. And my compensation? Room and board plus $20 a month, he said. More if the cattle sale goes well come fall. That seems fair, I agreed, and I would like Sundays free for church, if possible. Course, he said again. We ain't been much lately, but we should start again. For appearances, if nothing else. The thought seemed to trouble him. I gathered my courage to address the most delicate matter. Mr. Blackwell, I want to be clear that while I'll do my best for your children, I won't be party to deception beyond what's necessary. I won't invent elaborate falsehoods about a courtship or marriage that never happened. His expression hardened slightly. No one's asking you to lie beyond saying you're my wife. Most folks mind their own business if you don't give them reason to pry. Very well, I said, nodding. I believe we understand each other. I hope so, Miss Wilkes. He straightened. Supper's in an hour. It ain't much. Just beans and ham. I'll bring your other trunk up directly. Thank you. He lingered a moment longer, seeming on the verge of saying something else, then simply nodded and departed. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, trying to absorb the reality of my situation. The homestead was more desperate than I'd imagined, the children more damaged, and Elijah Blackwell more guarded. What had I gotten myself into? After a sparse but edible supper, during which Timothy chattered constantly, Jacob pushed food around his plate, and Sarah ate with mechanical precision while never looking up. Elijah excused himself to check on the herd. Calving season, he explained briefly. Need to make sure the new mothers are settled for the night. Alone with the children, I suggested helping them with their evening routines. Timothy eagerly accepted, while Jacob sullenly announced he could wash himself. Sarah simply drifted upstairs without acknowledgement. By the time I'd helped Timothy wash his face and hands, read him a story from my teaching primer, and tucked him into bed, the house had grown quiet. I returned to my small room, finally able to unpack in solitude. I carefully removed my mother's Bible from its wrappings, placing it on the bedside table where I could read it before sleeping. Next came my teaching materials, primers, slate, chalk, and the literature anthologies I'd used with my Boston pupils. I arranged these on the small shelf above the dresser. My clothing filled barely half the dresser drawers. I'd left most of my Boston finery behind, bringing only practical dresses, shirtwaists, and skirts suitable for ranch life. The blue silk I'd planned to wear for my wedding to Thomas remained in Boston, a reminder of dreams best forgotten. As I changed into my nightgown and unbraided my hair, a soft sound penetrated the thin wall between my room and the next. I paused, listening. It came again. The unmistakable sound of muffled sobbing. Sarah, I pressed my hand against the wall, wishing I could reach through it to comfort the child on the other side. What did one say to a girl who had lost her mother and her voice? What comfort could a stranger possibly offer? Sinking onto my bed, I felt the full weight of the task before me. These children needed far more than cleaned clothes and cooked meals. They needed healing that I wasn't qualified to provide. And their father, a man clearly drowning in grief and responsibility, needed more than temporary household help. I reached for my mother's Bible, the leather smooth and comforting beneath my fingers. Opening it to a familiar passage, I read the words that had sustained me through my own trials. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. The crying from the next room had quieted. I wondered if Sarah could hear me reading softly, if the ancient words of comfort might penetrate the wall between us. Be still and know that I am God, I continued, drawing strength from the verse. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The silence from Sarah's room now seemed more peaceful. I closed the Bible, keeping my finger between the pages to mark my place. Lord, I whispered, I don't know why you've brought me here to this broken family. I don't know if I can be what they need. But I promise to try with your help. Outside, an owl called softly from a nearby tree. Through my window, stars scattered across the Montana sky like diamond dust on black velvet. It was beautiful in its wild way, so different from Boston's constrained and proper vistas. As I braided my hair for sleep, I realized that perhaps this temporary arrangement might be exactly what I needed too. A place to heal from my own disappointments before beginning anew in San Francisco. Whether I could help heal the Blackwell family in return remained to be seen. Chapter 3: Finding Rhythm. I woke before the roosters crow, the habit already ingrained after 2 weeks at Blackwell Ranch. The floorboards felt cool beneath my bare feet as I slipped from bed and dressed quietly in the gray pre-dawn light. A glance at the small clock on my bedside table confirmed the hour. Not yet 5, but there was much to accomplish before the household stirred. Moving through the shadowed hallway, I paused at each child's door. Timothy's soft snores brought a smile to my lips. Jacob had kicked off his covers as usual, and I resisted the motherly urge to tuck them back around him. At Sarah's door, I hesitated, listening for the quiet, even breathing that told me she slept peacefully, a welcome change from the muffled sobs that had marked my first nights here. The kitchen waited below, no longer the chaotic domain I'd first encountered. Over the past fortnight, I'd scrubbed every surface, organized jumbled drawers, and established a proper pantry system. The cast iron cook stove, once crusted with spills, now gleamed with careful blacking. Copper pots hung in tidy rows, and the wooden table had been scrubbed until the grain shone. I lit the stove with practiced movements, feeding kindling into its hungry maw until flames caught and began to warm the iron surface. While it heated, I mixed biscuit dough, my fingers working the cold butter into flour with deft precision. The rhythmic kneading soothed me, each press and fold building a foundation for the day ahead. Coffee came next, a proper brew, not the bitter, scorched liquid the children had described from their father's attempts. I measured the grounds carefully, knowing Elijah preferred his coffee strong but not acrid. The percolator bubbled cheerfully on the stove surface, sending its rich aroma through the kitchen. As golden light began to filter through the windows, I sliced ham, fried eggs, and opened a jar of applesauce I'd discovered in the root cellar. Rebecca's preserving, still good despite being overlooked for months. The biscuits rose in the oven, their buttery scent mingling with the coffee's earthy fragrance. While breakfast cooked, I assembled lunch pails for the day, thick sandwiches, molasses cookies I'd baked yesterday, and apples polished to a shine. Each pail received a folded napkin and a note, a simple "learn well" for Jacob, a picture of a smiling face for Timothy, and a carefully chosen Bible verse for Sarah. Small gestures, but I learned that consistency in such matters could build bridges where words failed. The back door creaked, announcing Elijah's return from early chores. I straightened, smoothing my apron as he stepped inside, bringing with him the sense of hay, leather, and crisp morning air. He halted just inside the doorway, hat in hand, taking in the transformed kitchen. His gaze traveled from the neatly laid table to the steaming coffee pot to the lunch pails lined up on the sideboard. When his eyes finally met mine, Something flickered in their blue depth. Surprise, certainly, but something more elusive as well. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," I said, pouring a cup of coffee and extending it to him. "Breakfast is nearly ready." He accepted the cup with calloused hands, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "You've been busy," he observed, his voice still rough with the morning's disuse. "I find I'm an early riser by nature," I replied, turning back to the stove to hide the small, satisfied smile that threatened to emerge at his understated reaction. Elijah took a sip of coffee, then another, more deliberate one. "This is good," he said, surprise evident in his tone. "Thank you." I removed the biscuits from the oven, golden brown and fragrant. "The kitchen looks—" He paused, searching for words. "Different. Cleaner, I should hope," I said lightly, setting the biscuits on the table. A hint of something that might have been amusement touched his lips. I was going to say orderly, but cleaner works too. He hesitated, then added awkwardly, "Thank you, Miss Wilkes, for all this." It was the first genuine appreciation he'd shown since my arrival, and I found myself unaccountably pleased by it. "You're welcome, Mr. Blackwell." Our eyes met again briefly before the thunder of small feet on the stairs announced the children's awakening, breaking the moment between us. "And this," I explained to Timothy, pointing to the letter on the slate, "makes the sound T, like in your name, Timothy." "To Timothy," he echoed enthusiastically, bouncing on his chair in the corner of the parlor I'd transformed into a schoolroom. A small table salvaged from the attic, 2 chairs, and a portable blackboard created a learning space that kept the children's education progressing despite the remote location. "That's right," I praised, smiling at his eagerness. "Now, can you find something else in this room that starts with T?" While Timothy scampered around searching for objects, I glanced at Jacob, hunched sullenly over his arithmetic. "How are those multiplication tables coming along?" He shrugged, pencil moving grudgingly across his slate. "Don't see why I need to know 9 times 7. Won't help me run cattle." "Every rancher must keep accurate counts and calculate profits," I replied evenly. "Your father does sums every day in his ledger books." This gave him pause, though he tried not to show it. "Pa says book learning isn't as important as knowing the land." "Both have their place," I countered. "A wise rancher masters both." Across the room, Sarah sat in the window seat, apparently absorbed in watching a robin build its nest in the old oak tree. But I'd noticed her head tilt slightly whenever Jacob and I spoke of ranching, and I suspected she absorbed far more than she let on. "Sarah," I called gently, "would you like to join us? I've brought a book of pressed flowers that might interest you." Her gaze flickered toward me, then back to the window. No acknowledgement, but no outright rejection either. "Progress, of a sort." "Table," Timothy shouted triumphantly, patting the schoolroom table. "4 table." "Excellent," I praised, making a show of writing a table on the slate. "What else can you find?" As Timothy continued his hunt and Jacob returned to his sums with marginally less resistance, I quietly opened the book of pressed flowers and set it on the window seat beside Sarah. Not pushing, merely offering. From the corner of my eye, I saw her fingers tentatively touch the page. Small victories, I reminded myself. With these children, healing would come in inches, not miles. "Careful with that seedling," I instructed, kneeling in the freshly turned earth of what would become the vegetable garden. "Hold it gently by the root ball. Yes, just like that." Timothy clutched the tomato seedling with exaggerated care, his small face screwed up in concentration. We'd spent the morning clearing the overgrown garden beds behind the house, unearthing what had once been a productive kitchen garden before neglect had claimed it. Jacob worked several feet away, driving stakes for the pea trellis, with more enthusiasm than I'd seen him display for any task yet. There was something about working the soil that seemed to ease his perpetual scowl, though he'd deny any enjoyment if questioned directly. "Miss Grace?" Timothy asked, carefully placing the seedling in the hole I'd prepared. "Will the tomatoes grow big enough to eat by supper time?" I laughed, showing him how to pat soil around the delicate roots. No, sweet boy, plants need time to grow, just like children. These won't be ready until high summer. His face fell momentarily, then brightened. That's my birthday, July 22nd. Then we shall declare these Timothy's special birthday tomatoes, I said solemnly, and take extra good care of them. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Sarah hovering at the garden's edge, watching our work with poorly concealed interest. Unlike our schoolroom sessions, where she maintained careful distance, the garden seemed to draw her despite herself. Sarah, I called casually, would you look in that shed and see if there's a watering can? These seedlings need a drink after their journey. To my surprise, she moved immediately toward the tumble-down garden shed. When she emerged moments later, she carried not only a rusted watering can, but also a leather-bound book, its cover faded, but still beautiful. She approached hesitantly, setting the watering can beside me before opening the book to display a page of handwritten notes and carefully pressed plant specimens. What a wonderful find, I said quietly, recognizing a gardener's journal. May I see? Sarah placed it in my hands with unexpected gentleness. As I turned the pages, I discovered a meticulous record of the Blackwell garden, planting dates, harvest notes, and pressed samples from successful varieties. The flowing handwriting could only belong to Rebecca Blackwell. This was your mother's garden journal, I said, careful to keep my tone even, neither too emotional nor too detached. She was clearly a gifted gardener. Sarah nodded once, her eyes on the book rather than on me. Look here, I continued, pointing to a sketch of garden rows. She's marked where everything should be planted. That would explain why I found mint by the back steps. She's noted it grows best there. Sarah's finger touched a dried sprig of thyme, affixed to one page. Yes, thyme, I agreed. Do you know where your mother planted it? To my astonishment, Sarah turned and walked purposefully to the far corner of the garden. She knelt, brushing aside dead leaves to reveal a woody herb plant, struggling beneath the debris. She looked back at me with quiet triumph in her eyes. You remember, I said softly, you helped her in this garden, didn't you? Another nod, barely perceptible. I joined her, kneeling in the soil beside the thyme plant. Would you show me where the other herbs were planted? With your help and your mother's journal, we could restore her garden exactly as she had it. Something shifted in Sarah's expression. Not quite a smile, but a loosening of the tight mask she typically wore. She took the journal back from me and turned to a detailed drawing of the herb section, then pointed to spots in the overgrown bed where each variety should be. We worked side by side for the next hour, Sarah pointing and me digging carefully to uncover surviving perennials. Jacob and Timothy joined us, Jacob feigning disinterest while surreptitiously checking the journal's vegetable layouts, Timothy chattering about the hiding plants we were finding. None of us noticed Elijah until his shadow fell across the garden beds. He stood at the edge of the newly turned earth, hat in hand, staring at the scene before him, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Bah! Timothy called. We're fixing Mama's garden. Sarah knows where everything goes. Elijah's gaze moved to his daughter, kneeling in the dirt with soil smudging her dress, the precious journal open beside her. Something flickered across his features. Pain, certainly, but perhaps something else as well. Hope, fragile as the seedlings we'd just planted. Rebecca always did say the garden wouldn't grow right if you put things in the wrong places, he said finally, his voice rough. Looks like you've got a good teacher there. I wasn't sure if he meant me or the journal or Rebecca's memory living on in Sarah. Perhaps all three. Sarah didn't look up at her father, but her shoulders straightened slightly at his words. Another small victory. Another inch of healing. Sunday morning dawned clear and mild. Perfect weather for our first appearance in town as a married couple. I dressed with particular care in my best blue dress, a modest but well-tailored garment that had served me well at Boston school functions. My hair, usually confined to a simple bun for ranch work, I arranged in a more becoming style, with soft curls framing my face. The children, too, were transformed by their Sunday best. Timothy beamed with pride in his little suit, turning in circles to try to see how the polished buttons gleamed. Jacob submitted to having his cowlick tamed with water and a comb, grumbling but secretly pleased with his grown-up appearance. Sarah wore a dress I'd altered from one of her outgrown frocks, freshened with new ribbon at the collar and cuffs. When Elijah appeared from his bedroom in a clean shirt and his good suit, cleanly shaven for the first time since my arrival, I caught myself staring a moment too long. Without the stubble that typically shadowed his jaw, he looked younger, the handsome boy from my childhood memories momentarily visible beneath the careworn exterior. "You look very nice, Mr. Blackwell," I said politely, adjusting Timothy's collar to hide my momentary discomposure. "As do you, Miss Wilkes," he replied with equal formality, before catching himself. "Though I suppose today it's Mrs. Blackwell." The title sent an odd flutter through me that I promptly dismissed as anxiety about our deception. The wagon ride to town passed pleasantly enough, with Timothy's excited chatter filling any awkward silences. As we approached the white clapboard church at the edge of Pinecrest, however, Elijah grew noticeably tenser, his hands tight on the reins. "We haven't been to services much since Rebecca passed," he said quietly, pitched for my ears alone while the children were distracted by the sight of other families arriving. "Folks will be curious." "We'll give them little to gossip about," I assured him, though my own stomach tightened at the scrutiny we would face. A respectable family attending Sunday worship together, nothing more, nothing less. He nodded, drawing the wagon to a halt. After helping the children down, he came around to my side, offering his hand to assist me. As my feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately release my hand. "Ready, Mrs. Blackwell?" he asked, a question that seemed to carry more weight than the simple words suggested. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell," I replied steadily, though my pulse had quickened. With Timothy skipping ahead and Jacob and Sarah following more sedately, we approached the church steps. I was acutely aware of the curious glances, the whispered comments behind fans and hymnals. Elijah must have felt it too, for as we reached the church doors, he surprised me by gently taking my hand and placing it in the crook of his arm. The gesture, so proper and yet so unexpectedly intimate, sent a curious warmth spreading through me. His arm felt solid beneath my fingers, a tangible reminder that we faced this scrutiny together. Inside, we took a pew near the middle, the children arranged between us. Throughout the service, I maintained a composed smile, joined confidently in hymns I knew well, and resisted the urge to fidget under the congregation's curious stares. Beside me, Elijah sat stiffly at first, but gradually relaxed as the familiar rhythms of worship enfolded us. When it came time for the greeting of peace, he turned to me with an expression that might almost have been apologetic. "Peace be with you," he murmured, the traditional words somehow more personal on his lips. "And also with you," I replied softly. After the service, we could not escape the flood of well-wishers and curious neighbors. Elijah surprised me with his ability to deflect direct questions about our courtship with vague references to having known each other as children and reconnecting through Matthew. Not quite lies, but not the full truth either. Through it all, his hand remained at the small of my back, a warm, steady presence guiding me through the social minefield. I found myself instinctively leaning into that touch, playing my role with what I hoped appeared like natural affection. "Mrs. Blackwell," trilled a plump woman in an over-trimmed bonnet, approaching us as we tried to make our way to the wagon. "I'm Mrs. Prescott, head of the Ladies' Aid Society. We're simply dying to welcome you properly to Pinecrest." "How kind," I replied with a smile I hoped didn't appear as strained as it felt. "You simply must join us for our Wednesday meeting," she continued, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail of my appearance. "And I shall call on you for tea tomorrow to welcome you properly to our little community." Before I could formulate a polite evasion, Elijah spoke up. "That's mighty kind, Mrs. Prescott, but my wife is still settling in. Perhaps next week would be better." "Nonsense," the woman said firmly. "New friends are blessings to be cultivated immediately. I shall arrive at 2 o'clock tomorrow." With a definitive nod, she swept away to corner another victim. "I'm sorry," Elijah murmured as we finally escaped to our wagon. "Eugenia Prescott is a force of nature. Been organizing Pinecrest Society since the town was 3 cabins and a saloon." "It's fine," I assured him. The prospect of entertaining the town busybody made my stomach knot. "All part of maintaining our arrangement." His eyes met mine, apologetic and something else I couldn't quite name. "You handled yourself well in there." "Thank you." Such simple words, yet they warmed me more than they should have. "And how exactly did Mr. Blackwell propose, my dear?" Mrs. Prescott asked, setting down her teacup with a clink that somehow managed to sound suspicious. "Matthew Wilkes gave us all such a surprise, announcing his friend had married his sister back east with hardly any notice." I took a deliberate sip of tea, using the moment to compose my thoughts. Mrs. Prescott had arrived promptly at 2 the following day, dressed in rustling black silk that seemed designed to intimidate. For the past 30 minutes she had conducted what amounted to a genteel interrogation, probed for inconsistencies in our hastily constructed fiction. "It was a simple, private affair," I replied calmly. "Elijah was in Boston on cattle business. We reconnected through my brother, and circumstances aligned to make a quick ceremony practical." "Circumstances?" Her eyebrows rose suggestively. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from guilt but from indignation at the implication. "My teaching position had ended," I clarified coolly, "and Elijah was concerned about the children needing a mother's influence. We had known each other in childhood, so it wasn't the rashness it might appear to those unacquainted with our history." Mrs. Prescott's eyes narrowed slightly. "The children seemed to be adjusting well to your presence. Particularly remarkable with Sarah. Dr. Wilson had concerns about her continued silence." I set down my cup with deliberate care. "Children need patience and consistency, Mrs. Prescott. Sarah will speak when she's ready." She murmured noncommittally. "And what of your own children, Mrs. Blackwell? Do you and Elijah plan to add to your family soon?" The question, intended to discomfit me, succeeded admirably. I felt my face grow warm again. Years of managing impertinent questions from Boston society matrons came to my aid. "That is in God's hands, Mrs. Prescott," I replied with a serenity I was far from feeling. "For now, my focus is on helping the children already entrusted to my care." From the doorway came a soft clearing of a throat. Elijah stood there, hat in hand, looking somewhat abashed at interrupting. "Forgive me, ladies," he said with careful formality. "I didn't realize you had company, my dear." The endearment so foreign on his lips, nevertheless, sent a peculiar flutter through my chest. "Mr. Blackwell," Mrs. Prescott greeted him with exaggerated warmth. "How fortunate you've joined us. I was just telling your lovely bride how pleased we all are to see the children thriving under her care." "Yes," he agreed, his eyes meeting mine briefly. "We're very fortunate." "I was particularly noting Sarah's improvement," Mrs. Prescott continued. "Such a tragedy. Her condition. Dr. Wilson had quite despaired of her ever speaking again." A flash of something, anger, pain, crossed Elijah's face before he controlled it. "Sarah will find her voice when she's ready, ma'am. We don't pressure her." Of course, Mrs. Prescott soothed, though her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of having provoked a reaction. "Well, I really must be going. So many calls to make this afternoon." As I walked her to the door, she paused to deliver a parting shot. "Such a charming family picture you make, Mrs. Blackwell. One would hardly guess you'd been married such a short time." After she departed, I returned to the parlor to find Elijah still standing there, looking uncomfortable in his own home. "I apologize for the interruption," he said stiffly. "I thought she might be gone by now." "Your timing was perfect," I assured him. "A few more minutes of her questions, and I might have forgotten our agreed-upon story entirely." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "You handled her well. Rebecca never could." He stopped abruptly, the almost smile vanishing. "I should get back to work." As he turned to leave, I said quietly, "She asked about your proposal." I kept it vague, said we reconnected through Matthew when you were in Boston on cattle business. He nodded, not quite meeting my eyes. "That's fine. Simple stories are easiest to remember. Yes, I agreed, though Mrs. Prescott seemed determined to uncover complexities. Eugenia Prescott would question the Pope himself given half a chance, Elijah said dryly. Don't let her fluster you. I won't, I promised, surprised by the spark of humor we'd unexpectedly shared. After he left, I gathered the tea things, reflecting that, for all its awkwardness, our charade had held under the town busybody's scrutiny. A small victory, but significant nonetheless. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the barnyard as I hung the last of the washing on the line. The children had finished their lessons early, and I'd released them to play while I completed the day's chores. Now, with a rare moment of solitude, I found myself drawn to the barn, where I'd heard music earlier. Jacob's harmonica played hesitantly when he thought no one was listening. The barn door stood ajar, golden shafts of late sunlight cutting through the dusty interior. I moved quietly, not wanting to disturb whoever might be seeking their own moment of peace inside. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I spotted a small figure perched high in the hayloft. Sarah sat alone, legs dangling over the edge, something clutched in her hand that caught the light. Not Jacob's harmonica after all, but something else. I should have retreated, left her to her private contemplation, but something in her solitary posture called to me. Gathering my skirts, I mounted the ladder to the hayloft, making enough noise that she wouldn't be startled by my appearance. She turned as I reached the top, quickly tucking the object into her pocket. I pretended not to notice, settling myself a respectful distance away on the hay. I've always loved barns, I commented conversationally, the smells of hay and leather, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. My grandparents had a barn much like this one when I was a girl. Sarah didn't respond, but she didn't leave either, which I counted as permission to continue. I used to hide in the loft when I was sad, I continued, watching the yard through the open hayloft door. Especially after my mother died. I was 8, not much younger than you are now. From the corner of my eye, I saw her head turn slightly toward me. Scarlet fever took her, I said quietly. One day she was helping me with my sampler, the next she was burning with fever, and a week later she was gone. I didn't speak much after that either. This was not strictly true. I had become withdrawn but never mute. Yet something told me Sarah needed to hear that her response to grief was not unique or shameful. My father gave me her hairbrush, I continued, silver-backed with her initials engraved on it. I used to take it to the hayloft and hold it, feeling closer to her somehow. Sarah's hand moved to her pocket, and slowly she withdrew the object she'd hidden. A silver-backed hairbrush, its tarnished surface still beautiful. Your mother's? I asked gently. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the brush, rather than on me. It's beautiful, I said. Do you come here to feel closer to her? Another nod, so slight I almost missed it. That's a good thing to do, I assured her, to remember, to keep her close in your heart. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the lengthening shadows outside. Then, to my surprise, Sarah shifted slightly closer, not touching me, but narrowing the gap between us. I still miss my mother, I told her softly. But the sharp pain fades, Sarah. It becomes a gentle ache instead, one you can carry without it breaking you. She didn't respond, but as we climbed down from the loft a few minutes later, her hand briefly brushed against mine. The barest whisper of contact, but deliberate. Not forgiveness for replacing her mother, perhaps, but acceptance of my presence in her life. Another small victory, another inch of healing. The house lay quiet and dark as I worked at the kitchen table, the single lamp casting a warm glow over the account books spread before me. The children had been asleep for hours, and I had expected Elijah back from the north pasture long before now. Worry gnawed at me, though I told myself it was merely concern for the household's order, not for the man himself. To distract myself, I tackled the ranch accounts, a jumble of receipts, hastily noted expenses, and incomplete ledgers that painted a troubling financial picture. Without prying, I deduced that the Blackwell Ranch operated on increasingly thin margins, with debts mounting and income uncertain. With my pencil, I drafted a list of possible economies, ways to stretch their resources without compromising the children's needs. Small things, rendering tallow for candles instead of buying them, repurposing flour sacks for dish towels, planting more root vegetables for winter storage. As I worked, my gaze fell on Elijah's shirt, laid aside for mending. The sleeve had torn at the seam, and several buttons hung by threads. Setting aside the account books, I reached for my sewing basket, finding comfort in the rhythmic motion of needle and thread. I didn't recall growing sleepy, but the sound of the door latch startled me awake. Elijah stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. He looked exhausted, hat in hand, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. "Miss Wilkes," he said softly, stepping into the lamplight. "What are you doing up at this hour?" I straightened, disconcerted to realize I'd dozed off over my mending. "I was waiting to make sure you returned safely," I admitted. "The north pasture is quite distant." "Had a heifer in trouble," he explained, moving further into the kitchen. His gaze fell on the mended shirt in my hands, then shifted to the organized account books. "You've been busy." "Just tidying up a bit," I said, suddenly self-conscious about examining his financial records. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I might help organize things." Instead of the defensiveness I expected, he simply nodded, too weary to maintain his usual guardedness. "Could use some organizing, that's certain." He picked up the list of economies I'd drafted, scanning it with tired eyes. "These are good ideas," he said, finally setting it down. "Rebecca would have thought of similar measures." The comparison, casual as it was, warmed me unexpectedly. "I'm glad you approve. I didn't want to overstep." "You're helping," he said simply. "Can't fault that." His gaze returned to me, lingering a moment longer than usual, taking in my loosened hair and the smudge of ink I could feel on my cheek. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a hint of something unguarded. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Morning comes early." "Yes," I agreed, gathering my sewing things. "You should rest too. You look exhausted." "Been a long day," he admitted. As I rose to leave, he added, "Thank you for waiting up, for caring about—" He gestured vaguely at the account books, the mended shirt, the children sleeping upstairs. All of it." "You're welcome," I replied softly. As I moved past him toward the stairs, I swayed slightly with fatigue. His hand shot out to steady me, warm and strong against my elbow. The contact, brief as it was, sent an unexpected jolt through me. "Good night, Mr. Blackwell," I murmured, suddenly eager to escape the confusing feelings his proximity evoked. "Elijah," he said unexpectedly, "might as well use my given name when we're alone. Seems foolish to keep up formalities after you've darned my socks." The hint of humor in his voice surprised a small laugh from me. "Very well, Elijah. Then I'm Grace." "Good night, Grace," he said, my name sounding different somehow in his low, rough voice. "Good night." I hurried up the stairs, unsettled by the warmth that had bloomed in my chest at the sound of my name on his lip. In the darkened hallway, I paused, glancing back to see Elijah still standing in the kitchen, staring at the mended shirt in his hands, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher from a distance. Then, with deliberate care, he draped his coat over the chair where I'd been sitting, his fingers lingering on the worn fabric, as if it were something precious. I turned away, suddenly conscious of intruding on a private moment. Whatever Elijah Blackwell was feeling as he stood alone in his kitchen, holding evidence of another woman's care in his calloused hands, was not for me to witness. Yet as I slipped into my room and prepared for bed, I couldn't quite dismiss the image of his face in that unguarded moment, or the answering warmth it had kindled within me. An unexpected complication in what was supposed to be a simple business arrangement. Sleep eluded me for some time as I contemplated this development. I had come to help children in need, not to lose my heart to their grieving father. Yet, as I finally drifted toward dreams, I couldn't help wondering if perhaps this journey might lead to destinations I'd never anticipated when I stepped off that stagecoach 2 weeks ago. Chapter 4: Spring Thaw. I woke before sunrise to the familiar sounds of Elijah's boots on the back porch. Every morning for the past week, he'd risen earlier and stayed out later, the demands of calving season stretching him thin as parchment. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders stooped with fatigue when he thought no one was watching. The decision came to me suddenly, born of practical necessity rather than sentiment. I dressed quickly in my plainest work dress, covering my hastily pinned hair with a calico bonnet, and slipped downstairs while the children still slept. The air held the particular crispness of early spring mornings, cold enough to sting the lungs, yet somehow promising warmth by midday. Dew sparkled on the new grass, and the eastern sky had just begun to blush pink when I pushed open the heavy barn door. The familiar sense of hay, leather, and animals greeted me as I entered the dim interior. Our milk cow, a gentle Jersey named Buttercup, lowed softly from her stall. In the corner stood the milking stool and pail, awaiting Elijah's attention, one more task in his endless day. "Good morning, pretty girl," I murmured, approaching Buttercup with more confidence than I felt. My childhood visits to my grandparents' ranch had included watching the milking process, but I'd never attempted it myself. I positioned the stool, set down the pail, and contemplated the logistics. Buttercup turned her head to regard me with liquid brown eyes that seemed mildly amused by my presence. "I realize this is a departure from routine," I told her seriously, "but Mr. Blackwell, Elijah, needs rest more than he'll admit. So we shall have to come to an understanding, you and I." Taking a deep breath, I seated myself on the stool and reached for her udder with uncertain hands. Buttercup shifted, clearly unimpressed with my technique. "Now, see here," I said firmly. "I'm doing my best under the circumstances." I tried again, mimicking the motion I'd seen others use: grip, squeeze, pull. Nothing happened. I frowned, adjusted my position, and tried once more. A thin stream of milk pinged against the pail, startling me so that I nearly lost my grip. "Progress," I murmured, trying again. I was so absorbed in my task that I didn't hear the barn door open. Only Buttercup's soft moo of recognition alerted me to Elijah's presence. "Miss Wilkes?" His voice held such bafflement that I nearly laughed despite my embarrassment at being caught in my inept attempt. "What are you doing?" I looked up, blowing a loose strand of hair from my eyes. "Milking the cow, or attempting to, at any rate." He stepped closer, hat in hand, his expression caught between confusion and something else I couldn't quite name. "I can see that. The question is why?" "Because you're exhausted," I said plainly, returning to my task with renewed determination. "You're managing newborn calves, fence repairs, and a dozen other tasks. Surely I can manage this one." "Milking's not ladies' work," he protested, though without much conviction. "Perhaps not in Boston," I conceded, "but practical needs must outweigh social niceties on a working ranch. Besides, the poor creature is in discomfort." I gave Buttercup an apologetic pat. "Though I fear my technique leaves much to be desired." A strange sound escaped him then, and I looked up sharply to find Elijah Blackwell doing something I'd never witnessed before. Laughing. It was rusty, as though long unused, but unmistakable. "What's so amusing?" I demanded, though I couldn't help smiling in response. "You," he admitted, setting his hat on a nearby post, "sitting there looking determined as a general leading troops, while poor Buttercup suffers your learning curve." "I'm improving," I protested, gesturing to the meager amount in the pail. "At this rate, we'll have enough for coffee by sundown," he teased, the unexpected lightness in his voice warming me more than it should have. "Perhaps a demonstration would be more helpful than mockery," I suggested primly. To my surprise, he came to stand behind me. "Like this," he said, his voice close to my ear as he demonstrated the proper grip with his own hands. Firm but gentle, with a steady rhythm. I tried again under his watchful eye, rewarded with a stronger stream of milk hitting the pail. There, you see, perfectly capable. Never doubted it, he said, and there was that smile again, transforming his features like sunshine breaking through clouds. My next attempt produced an impressive stream, and I looked up at him with undisguised triumph. I believe Buttercup and I have reached an understanding. He chuckled, the second time in as many minutes, and the sound crackled between us like kindling catching flame. Suddenly we were both laughing, the shared moment of simple humor melting something that had remained frozen between us since my arrival. "Well done, Grace," he said, using my given name without hesitation for the first time. "Though I reckon Buttercup might resist your technique improves before tomorrow." "Practice makes perfect," I replied, unable to stop smiling even as I resumed my work. "You attend to your calves. Buttercup and I shall manage splendidly." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly, the simple words carrying more weight than seemed possible. As he turned to leave, I called after him. "I expect you to teach me other ranch skills as well. I'm quite determined to make myself useful." "Never doubted that, either," he called back, and I could hear the smile in his voice even as the barn door closed behind him. I returned to my milking, humming softly to Buttercup, my spirits inexplicably lifted by that shared moment of laughter, as if a long winter had finally begun to thaw. "Careful with that blanket, Timothy," I called, watching the 4-year-old drag a woolen coverlet toward the garden with more enthusiasm than coordination. "Mind it doesn't touch the ground." April had brought capricious weather to our corner of Montana, warm days that coaxed blossoms and seedlings from the earth, followed by bitter nights that threatened to undo all our gardening progress. Tonight promised to be particularly cold, with frost warnings that put our newly planted garden at risk. I'd spent the afternoon organizing our defense, gathering old blankets and sheets to cover tender plants, preparing smudge pots that would burn through the night to keep the air around our precious seedlings just warm enough to survive. "Like this, Miss Grace?" Jacob called, carefully draping a faded quilt over the row of pea seedlings. His splinted arm, broken in a fall 3 weeks prior, limited his movements, but he'd insisted on helping despite my concerns. "Perfect," I assured him. "Now place those rocks along the edges to hold it down." In the fading light, the 3 children and I worked steadily, transforming the garden into a patchwork landscape of coverings. Sarah worked silently but efficiently, her gentle hands arranging each protective layer with particular care over her mother's beloved herbs. "Will the plants be scared of the dark under the blankets?" Timothy asked, his forehead wrinkled in concern. "Not at all," I assured him, lighting one of the smudge pots with the long match. "They'll be cozy and warm, like you when you're tucked in bed." The pots began to release their steady heat and thin smoke, not enough to damage the plants, but sufficient to create a protective layer of warmer air through the night. "We'll need to check them every few hours," I explained to Jacob and Sarah, "to make sure the pots keep burning and the blankets stay in place." "I can help," Jacob volunteered immediately, puffing out his chest. "I don't mind getting up in the night." "Me too," Timothy chimed in, though I had doubts about his ability to stay awake past his bedtime. Sarah simply nodded, her solemn eyes reflecting the growing determination I'd observed in her these past weeks. As darkness settled around us, the back door opened, spilling lamplight across the yard. Elijah's silhouette appeared, then solidified as he approached our makeshift camp. "What's all this?" he asked, taking in the transformed garden, and the 4 of us huddled among smudge pots and covered plants. "Frost protection," I explained. "The temperature's dropping faster than expected, and I couldn't bear to lose all our work to one cold night." He surveyed our efforts, nodding slowly. "Smart thinking. These tender plants won't survive a hard frost without help. Grace says we have to keep the fires going all night," Jacob informed him importantly. "I'm taking first watch with her." Elijah's gaze moved from his son to me, something like wonder flickering across his features. Not at the garden preparations, I realized, but at Jacob's enthusiastic participation. "Just got back from checking the new calves," he said. 2 more born today, both healthy." He knelt to inspect one of the smudge pots. I can spell you on watch duty. You've got enough to manage with the house and children." "We're managing together," I corrected gently. "The children have been tremendous help." The pride on the children's faces at their father's approving nod warmed me more than the smudge pots ever could. For a moment, the four of us huddled in the garden beneath the vast Montana sky felt remarkably like a family united in common purpose. "I've set bread to rise for morning," I said, breaking the moment before its implications could unsettle me. "We should get inside and have supper before it gets too cold." As we gathered our tools and headed toward the welcoming light of the kitchen, Elijah fell into step beside me. "You're good with them," he said quietly. "Better than I'd hoped." The simple compliment caught me off guard. "They make it easy," I demurred. "They're wonderful children. They're healing," he replied, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Because of you." I didn't know how to respond to the raw honesty in his voice, so I simply nodded and quickened my pace toward the house, suddenly aware of my thundering heartbeat and the fact that our arrangement, initially so clearly defined, had begun to blur around the edges in ways I hadn't anticipated. "Higher, I want to see the bird's nest." Jacob's excited voice carried clearly from the hayloft. I looked up from sorting seed packets in the cool shadows of the barn to see him balanced precariously near the edge, his good arm reaching toward a rafter where barn swallows had built their nest. "Jacob Blackwell," I called sharply, "move back from that edge immediately." He glanced down, annoyance flashing across his face. "I'm fine, Miss Grace. I can reach it if I just—" What happened next unfolded with terrible speed. His reaching disrupted his balance, his injured arm couldn't compensate, and suddenly he was falling through the air with a cry that stopped my heart. The thud of his body hitting the packed earth floor echoed through the barn, followed by a horrifying silence. "Jacob!" I dropped the seeds and ran to where he lay crumpled and still. "Please, God," I prayed silently, "let him be alive." His eyes fluttered open as I knelt beside him, relief flooding through me at this sign of consciousness. "Don't move," I instructed, quickly assessing his condition. "My arm," he whimpered, tears filling his eyes. "It hurts something awful." The arm in question, his good one, not the already splinted limb, lay at an unnatural angle. Beneath his rolled-up sleeve, I could see the beginning of swelling and bruising. A simple glance confirmed my fears, a broken arm to match the one already healing. "Lie very still," I told him, keeping my voice calm despite my racing heart. "I need to check if you've hurt anything else." My father's medical texts, read during long Boston winters out of intellectual curiosity rather than professional aspiration, suddenly became invaluable. I carefully checked his head, neck, and back, relieved to find no signs of more serious injury. "Jacob?" Sarah's voice, high with alarm, came from the barn doorway. She must have heard the commotion from the garden where she'd been working. "Stay there," I called to her. "Jacob's had a fall. Run and fetch your father from the south field, quickly." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew Elijah wouldn't return in time to fetch the doctor before the arm began to set improperly. The nearest doctor was in town, a good hour's ride away, and Jacob's pain would only worsen with waiting. "Sarah," I amended, "bring me the blue box from the top shelf in the kitchen pantry, and clean cloths, and 2 straight sticks from the woodpile, smooth ones." Her eyes widened, but she nodded once and disappeared. "Am I going to die?" Jacob asked, his voice small and frightened in a way I'd never heard from this usually defiant child. "Absolutely not," I assured him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "You've broken your arm, but I'm going to help you until your father returns." Sarah reappeared with remarkable speed, her arms full of the requested supplies. The blue box, Rebecca's medicine chest, contained, among other things, a bottle of laudanum for pain. "Brave boy," I murmured to Jacob as I carefully measured a small dose. "This will help with the pain while I set your arm." His eyes widened. "Set it? Like a chicken bone?" Despite the gravity of the situation, I had to smile at his analogy. Similar principle, though rather more carefully done. I've assisted with this before. This was not entirely true, but I'd read detailed accounts and observed my father once with a farmhand's injury. After the laudanum had taken effect, dulling the worst of his pain, I felt along the break, determining it was a simple fracture rather than a compound one. A small mercy. With Sarah holding his shoulders steady, I took a deep breath and applied gentle but firm traction to realign the bones. Jacob's cry pierced my heart, but I forced myself to concentrate on the task. Almost done, I promised, maintaining the alignment while reaching for the splinting materials Sarah had prepared. "You're being so brave." By the time the arm was properly splinted and bound, Jacob had lapsed into exhausted silence, tears drying on his flushed cheeks. I just finished securing the last bandage when thundering footsteps announced Elijah's arrival. He burst through the barn door, hat gone, face white with fear. "What happened?" he demanded, dropping to his knees beside his son. "Fell from the loft," I explained quickly. "Broken arm, the other one. I've set and splinted it, but he should see the doctor when possible to confirm it's properly aligned." Elijah's gaze moved from Jacob's pale face to the neat splint, then to my hands, still steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "You said it yourself?" "My father was a doctor," I explained, though this was stretching the truth. He'd been a professor of medicine, more theoretician than practitioner. I've read his texts and assisted him occasionally. He looked at me then with something akin to wonder. "Most women would have panicked. Panic serves no purpose in crisis," I replied, gathering the remaining supplies. Sarah was my excellent assistant. His gaze shifted to his daughter, who knelt on Jacob's other side, her small hand clasping her brother's uninjured one. "Thank you, Sarah," he said softly. "And you," he added, looking back at me, "may have saved him from a lifetime of disability if we'd waited for the doctor." The raw gratitude in his voice made me uncomfortable somehow, as if I'd done something extraordinary rather than simply what was necessary. "Let's get him to bed," I suggested, deflecting the moment. "He needs rest, and we should keep the arm elevated." Together we carried Jacob to the house, settled him in bed, and made him comfortable. Throughout the process, Elijah followed my instructions without question, a remarkable shift from the man who'd initially been so resistant to my presence in his home. Later, after Jacob had fallen into laudanum-assisted sleep, Elijah found me in the kitchen preparing a simple broth for when the boy woke. "How did you know what to do?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes never leaving my face. I stirred the broth, choosing my words carefully. "My father's medical library was extensive, and I've always been an avid reader. Some knowledge simply stays with you. You saved my boy from worse injury," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "There's no need," I assured him, uncomfortable with his gratitude. "I've grown rather fond of your children, even Jacob, when he's not climbing where he shouldn't." A smile ghosted across his lips, then faded. I should have been here, should have been watching him. "You can't be everywhere," I said gently. "That's why I'm here." Our eyes met across the kitchen. And something shifted between us, a deepening of trust, perhaps, or recognition of shared purpose. "Yes," he agreed softly. "That's why you're here." But we both knew that my presence in the Blackwell household had gradually become about far more than our initial arrangement, a truth neither of us seemed quite ready to acknowledge. "The wolf huffed and puffed," I read, giving the villain an appropriately growly voice that made Timothy giggle from his perch on the floor. "But he could not blow the house down." Jacob, confined to bed rest for the 3rd day since his fall, actually smiled from his nest of pillows. "The pig was smart to use bricks," he observed, his splinted arms resting on a pillow across his lap. "Indeed," I agreed, turning the page to show the illustrations. "Foresight and proper materials make all the difference." Sarah sat in the window seat, ostensibly focused on her sampler, but clearly listening to the story. These afternoon reading sessions had become a cornerstone of our routine during Jacob's convalescence. The 4 of us gathered in his bedroom, connected by stories that transported us beyond the confines of the ranch. "Read the part with the chimney again," Jacob requested, shifting against his pillows. "And do the wolf's voice." I obliged, adopting a theatrical growl that sent Timothy into peals of laughter. To my astonishment, Jacob joined in, his clear, boyish laughter ringing out for the first time since my arrival at the ranch. The sound was so unexpected, so pure in its simple joy, that I nearly faltered in my reading. Across the room, Sarah's head had snapped up, her eyes wide with recognition of this long-absent sound. Neither of us noticed Elijah until a floorboard creaked beneath his weight. He stood frozen in the doorway, an expression of naked emotion on his face as he absorbed the scene before him, his injured son laughing, his youngest giggling helplessly. Even Sarah watching with the ghost of a smile on her lips. Our eyes met over the children's heads, and I saw moisture gathering in his before he blinked it away, composing himself with visible effort. "Pa!" Jacob called, uncharacteristically enthusiastic. "Miss Grace does the best wolf voice, even better than—" He stopped abruptly, his smile faltering. "Even better than Ma," he finished quietly, his admission hanging in the sudden silence. I held my breath, uncertain how Elijah would respond to this inadvertent comparison. His face worked briefly before settling into a gentle smile that must have cost him considerable effort. "Your mother did have a talent for voices," he agreed, moving into the room to perch at the foot of Jacob's bed. "Remember how she used to make the mouse in that one story sound so pitiful? And the bear in Goldilocks sound so grumpy?" Jacob added, watching his father carefully. "Just like Pa in the mornings," Timothy piped up, then clapped his hand over his mouth, eyes dancing with mischief. To my relief, Elijah laughed, a genuine sound that eased the tension from the room. "Fair enough, little man. I ain't exactly sweet-tempered before coffee." "Perhaps Miss Grace should read you bedtime stories too," Jacob suggested with 7-year-old innocence, unaware of how his words caused twin flushes to rise on both my cheeks and his father's. "Perhaps I should let Miss Grace finish this one first," Elijah replied smoothly, ruffling his son's hair. "Don't let me interrupt." I resumed reading, though acutely aware of Elijah's presence as he settled into the room's vacant chair, his long legs stretched before him, his attention seemingly fixed on the story but occasionally drifting to my face in a way that made consistent reading challenging. By the time I finished, Timothy had fallen asleep on the rug, and Jacob's eyelids drooped, despite his protests that he wasn't tired. "One more?" he pleaded as I closed the book. "Tomorrow," I promised, adjusting his pillows. "Your body needs rest to heal properly." Elijah scooped up Timothy, cradling his youngest with practiced ease. "Listen to Miss Grace," he told Jacob. "She knows what she's talking about, especially where mending broken lads is concerned." The simple vote of confidence warmed me as I straightened Jacob's covers and checked his splints one last time. Sarah slipped from the room with a small nod in my direction, the closest thing to farewell she ever offered. In the hallway, after settling Timothy in his own bed, Elijah spoke quietly. "Haven't heard Jacob laugh like that since before Rebecca died. Children are remarkably resilient," I offered, "given time and stability, and someone who cares enough to do different voices for storybook wolves," he added, a smile softening his features. I felt my cheeks warm again. Theatrical reading was my specialty at the seminary. The young ladies particularly enjoyed Jane Eyre, with full vocal distinctions. "I can imagine," he said, studying me with an expression that made me inexplicably nervous. "Thank you, Grace. Not just for Jacob's arm, but for bringing laughter back into this house." The sincerity in his voice felt dangerous somehow, an intimacy neither of us had bargained for when establishing our arrangement. I took a small step backward, needing physical distance to match the emotional boundaries I was struggling to maintain. "I should check on dinner," I said, though we both knew it was already simmering on the stove, requiring no immediate attention. He nodded, understanding my retreat without offense. "Of course." As I descended the stairs, I could feel his gaze following me, and with it the growing awareness that our carefully constructed pretense was developing authentic dimensions neither of us had anticipated. I was changing the linens in my room when I noticed it. A small, perfect robin's egg lying on my pillow, its delicate blue a startling contrast against the white cotton. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper. This was the third such gift I'd discovered in the past week. First had been a particularly smooth river stone veined with quartz that caught the light like diamonds. Then a cluster of early wildflowers, their delicate purple blooms still fresh with dew. Each gift had been accompanied by a neatly folded note. Blank, but the intention clear nonetheless. Each had appeared when I was elsewhere in the house, placed with careful deliberation on my pillow or dresser. I knew immediately who was leaving these tokens. Sarah, silent, watchful Sarah, had found a way to communicate without words. With gentle fingers, I lifted the fragile egg, marveling at its perfect formation and the trust implied in sharing such a treasure. Unfolding the paper, I found it empty, as expected, the blank page somehow more eloquent than words. Taking a sheet of my own stationery, I penned a brief response. Dear Sarah, what a beautiful egg. Is there a nest nearby? The color reminds me of your eyes when you smile. Yes, I've noticed that your eyes change color slightly when you're happy, though you try to hide it. Thank you for thinking of me. Yours truly, Grace. I left the note on my dresser, certain she would find it during her silent observations of the household. This wordless exchange had become a precious thread between us, tentative but strengthening with each small gift and written response. That evening, as I helped Sarah brush and braid her hair for bed, a ritual she had gradually allowed over the past weeks, I noticed her watching me in the mirror, a question in her eyes. Yes, I found the egg, I said, answering her unspoken query. It's the loveliest blue I've ever seen. She nodded once, satisfaction evident in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. I've left a note for you, I continued, working her golden hair into a neat plait. Perhaps tomorrow you might show me where the nest is. From a safe distance, of course. We wouldn't want to disturb the mother bird. Another nod, this one accompanied by the faintest curve of her lips. Not quite a smile, but moving in that direction. As I tied off her braid with a ribbon, I added casually, I had a friend in Boston who didn't speak for almost a year after her brother died. She used to write me notes too. Eventually, she found her voice again when she was ready. Sarah's eyes met mine in the mirror, widening slightly at this revelation. There's no hurry, I assured her, resting my hands lightly on her shoulders. Some feelings are too big for words until we're ready to give them shape. She turned then, surprising me by wrapping her arms around my waist in a brief, fierce hug before darting to her bed and beneath the covers. Good night, Sarah, I said softly, too moved to say more as I extinguished her lamp. A small hand emerged from beneath the quilts, forming a deliberate wave, our first true exchange of greetings, a bridge built of robin's eggs and river stones and patient notes. The ledger book fell from the back of the linen closet as I was reorganizing shelves, its worn leather cover hitting the floor with a dull thud. I knelt to retrieve it, intending to return it to its place without prying, when a folded paper slipped from between its pages. The paper contained a contract, terms of sale, for Elijah's cattle to a broker named James Harrington. What caught my eye were the prices, significantly lower than what Matthew had mentioned as fair market value during his last visit. Curious now, and concerned, I opened the ledger itself. What I found made my stomach clench with worry. The Blackwell Ranch operated on increasingly narrow margins, with debts mounting against projected income that depended entirely on the upcoming cattle sale. If Harrington was underpaying as significantly as it appeared, the ranch's future balanced on a knife's edge. I shouldn't have been looking at these private papers, yet I couldn't ignore what I'd found. The welfare of 3 children, children I'd grown to care for deeply, depended on this ranch's survival. I returned the ledger to its place, but kept the contract, determined to learn more before approaching Elijah with my concerns. My next letter to Matthew included careful questions about cattle prices and reputable buyers, framed as general curiosity. That evening, after the children were asleep, I sat at my small writing desk and composed another letter, this one far more difficult to write. Dear Thomas, I hope this letter finds you well. While our parting was difficult, I have always valued your integrity and knowledge of business matters. I paused, pen hovering over the paper. Thomas Pierce had been my fiancé until 3 months ago. when he'd broken our engagement upon learning I wouldn't inherit my grandmother's fortune as he'd expected. The wound was still fresh, his mercenary motives a harsh revelation after 2 years of courtship. Yet, despite his personal failings, Thomas worked at one of Boston's most respected banking houses, with connections throughout the Western Territories. If anyone could provide information about cattle broker James Harrington, it would be Thomas, assuming he would even respond to my letter. Taking a deep breath, I continued writing. I am temporarily situated on a Montana cattle ranch, assisting a widower with his children. The ranch owner appears to be involved with a cattle broker named James Harrington, based in Helena. I have reason to believe Mr. Harrington may be taking advantage of my employer's circumstances to negotiate unfair prices. Given your expertise in commercial banking and your firm's Western investments, might you have any information regarding Mr. Harrington's reputation or the current fair market prices for Montana cattle? I ask not out of idle curiosity, but out of concern for 3 children whose futures depend on this ranch's success. With sincere regards, Grace Wilkes. I sealed the letter before I could reconsider, knowing it would go out with tomorrow's post. The decision to contact Thomas felt both necessary and treacherous. Necessary for the Blackwell family's welfare, treacherous to my own heart in reopening communication with a man who had humiliated me. Yet as I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking not of Thomas and our broken engagement, but of Elijah. His weathered hands carefully holding Jacob after his fall, his rare laugh in the barn that morning, the unguarded tenderness in his eyes when he thanked me for bringing laughter back to his home. I blew out my lamp and lay in darkness, wondering when exactly the welfare of the Blackwell family had become so entwined with my own peace of mind. The spring storm struck with Montana's typical ferocity, little warning beyond darkening skies before wind and rain lashed the ranch with biblical intensity. By mid-afternoon, the children and I had secured the house, bringing in extra firewood and filling lamps in preparation for a long night. "Where's Pa?" Timothy asked, for the 3rd time, his small face pressed against the window as rain beat a relentless tattoo on the glass. "Pecking the far pasture," I reminded him, trying to keep my own worry from my voice. "He'll be back soon." But as afternoon stretched into evening with no sign of Elijah, my reassurances felt increasingly hollow. The far pasture lay 3 miles from the house, across terrain that would become treacherous in such weather. "Time for supper," I announced with forced cheerfulness, herding the children to the kitchen where a pot of stew simmered on the stove. "Your father will be hungry when he returns." We ate to the sound of rain and thunder, the children uncharacteristically quiet. Even Jacob, normally full of complaints, ate without protest, his eyes frequently drifting to the window. After supper, I organized diversions, checkers for Jacob, whittling lessons for Timothy using a soft pine block, mending for Sarah. But as the mantel clock chimed 8, with still no sign of Elijah, even these activities failed to distract from his absence. "Perhaps a Bible story before bed?" I suggested, gathering the children near the fire. "Something with storms seems appropriate." "The one about Jesus sleeping in the boat," Timothy requested immediately, "when all the disciples got scared of the storm." "An excellent choice," I agreed, opening Rebecca's family Bible to the Gospel of Mark. The familiar words soothed me as much as the children, as I read about the frightened disciples and Christ's calm in the tempest. "Peace be still," I read, the ancient command resonating through our own storm-besieged home. "Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith?" "Is Paul lost in the storm?" Timothy asked suddenly, cutting to the heart of our collective fear. I closed the Bible gently, choosing honesty tempered with hope. "Your father knows this land better than anyone. He may have taken shelter until the worst passes." "What if he's hurt?" Jacob's voice held an edge of panic that belied his usual bravado. "Then we pray," I said simply, "and trust that God watches over him, just as he watches over us." Sarah's hand slipped into mine, a gesture of solidarity that touched me deeply. Together, we bowed our heads while I offered a prayer for Elijah's safe return, my words steady despite the fear knotted in my chest. After tucking the children into bed with promises to wake them when their father returned, I took up my vigil by the parlor window. Outside, the storm raged unabated, rain now mixed with sleet that rattled against the glass like thrown pebbles. Midnight came and went. I stoked the fire, made fresh coffee, and returned to my post, straining to see through the darkness beyond the window. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, had me starting from my chair, hoping and fearing in equal measure. In those long hours of waiting, I confronted truths I'd been avoiding for weeks. My feelings for Elijah Blackwell had evolved far beyond our business arrangement. Somewhere amid milking lessons and broken arms, garden plantings, and storybook readings, I had committed the very folly I'd sworn to avoid. I'd begun to care for him, not as an employer, but as a man. The realization should have alarmed me. In less than 4 months, I was due to leave for my teaching position in San Francisco. Our arrangement had always been temporary, a mutually beneficial solution to immediate problems, not the foundation for deeper attachment. Yet as I kept watch through the storm, I couldn't deny the truth of my heart, or the fear that gripped it as the hours passed without Elijah's return. Just past 2 a.m, a movement in the yard caught my eye, a darker shadow against the night moving slowly toward the house. I grabbed a lantern and rushed to the door, heedless of propriety or caution. Elijah stood on the porch, soaked to the skin and swaying with exhaustion. His face, illuminated by my lantern, was pale beneath streaks of mud, his eyes hollow with fatigue. "Grace," he said, my name barely audible above the storm. "The children?" "Safe," I assured him, pulling him inside and bolting the door against the weather. "All asleep upstairs? What happened?" "Creek flooded," he managed, teeth chattering from cold. "Had to detour miles around. Horse nearly went down in the mud." I helped him to the fire, concern overriding any sense of impropriety as I began unbuttoning his sodden coat. "You need to get out of these wet clothes before you catch your death." His hands, nearly blue with cold, fumbled uselessly at the buttons. "Can't seem to," he began, then stopped as my fingers took over the task. "You're half frozen," I murmured, easing the heavy coat from his shoulders. "Sit by the fire while I fetch dry clothes and blankets." I hurried upstairs, gathering Elijah's nightshirt and robe from his bedroom, along with every spare blanket I could find. When I returned, he sat slumped before the fire, shivering violently, his wet shirt clinging to his broad shoulders. "Here," I said, placing the dry garments in his hands. "Change while I make coffee. Can you manage?" He nodded wordlessly, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. In the kitchen, I busied myself with the coffee pot, allowing him privacy to change while battling my own conflicted emotions. Relief at his safe return warred with lingering fear at how close we'd come to disaster. Beneath both lay a deeper awareness I couldn't quite suppress, that my concern transcended the appropriate boundaries of our arrangement. When I returned with steaming coffee, Elijah sat wrapped in blankets, his wet clothing puddled at his feet. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the vulnerability in his expression that few were ever permitted to see. "Thank you," he said hoarsely as I handed him the cup, his fingers brushing mine in the exchange. I should have withdrawn immediately, maintained proper distance. Instead, I knelt beside his chair, instinctively taking his free hand between both of mine, rubbing warmth back into his chilled fingers. "You're still freezing," I observed, focusing on his hand rather than his face. Safer, somehow, though the intimacy of the gesture belied any pretense of professional detachment. "Getting warmer by the minute," he replied softly, and something in his tone drew my gaze to his. The look that passed between us held a recognition neither of us had acknowledged before. That what had begun as convenience had evolved into something neither had anticipated. His fingers curled around mine, returning the pressure, the touch lingering, far longer than necessity required. In that moment of connection, with the storm raging outside and quiet breathing the only sound within, pretense fell away. "I was afraid," I admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "So was I," he confessed, his eyes never leaving mine. Out there in the dark, all I could think was that I needed to get back to... He paused, then finished simply, "home." The word hung between us, freighted with meaning neither of us was quite ready to articulate. Home. Not just a place, but the people within it. The people who waited, who worried, who cared. Slowly, reluctantly, I withdrew my hands from his, the moment stretching between us like a tangible thread, before finally breaking as I rose to my feet. The children will want to know you're safe, I said, retreating to safer ground. They were very worried. He nodded, understanding my withdrawal without offense. Thank you for looking after them, for waiting up. Of course, I replied, smoothing my skirts in a nervous gesture. That's why I'm here. But as our eyes met once more across the firelit room, we both recognized the inadequacy of that explanation and the complicated truth that had grown in its place. Chapter 5, Summer Revelations. I smoothed the collar of Timothy's new shirt, admiring the way the deep blue fabric brought out his eyes. Rebecca's eyes, though I tried not to dwell on that fact as I helped him into the matching vest I'd finished stitching only last night. Do I look handsome, Miss Grace? He asked, puffing out his small chest and striking a pose that nearly made me laugh aloud. Exceedingly handsome, I assured him, adjusting his miniature string tie. The finest-looking gentleman at the barn raising, I shouldn't wonder. June sunshine streamed through the bedroom window, promising a perfect day for the community gathering at Widow Jenkins' homestead. After a harsh winter and unpredictable spring, her barn had collapsed, leaving her without shelter for her small herd. The entire county had rallied, men offering labor, women organizing food, everyone contributing what they could to help restore what she'd lost. For the Blackwell family, it represented our first true social outing together, not merely the obligatory church attendance, but a full day of community interaction that would test the believability of our charade. Jacob appeared in the doorway, trying to appear nonchalant despite the obvious pride he took in his new clothes. Both his arms had finally healed, the splints removed just yesterday after Dr. Wilson pronounced him sturdy as a young oak, if somewhat less sense in that head of his. You look mighty fine, Jacob, I said, careful to keep my tone matter-of-fact rather than fussing. At 8, he'd become increasingly resistant to maternal attention, though I'd noticed he didn't object when I straightened his collar or brushed his hair out of his eyes. These trousers are better than my old ones, he admitted, running his hand over the sturdy cotton twill. Don't pinch behind the knees. I nodded seriously. Proper fit makes all the difference in a gentleman's comfort. The fabric for all 3 children's outfits had arrived last month from my order to Montgomery Ward. A small extravagance from my teaching savings, but one I considered necessary. Children growing as quickly as weeds needed clothes that fit properly, and I'd noticed how Jacob and Sarah both hunched their shoulders when wearing garments that had grown too small. Sarah joined us last, hovering in the doorway until I beckoned her forward. My breath caught at the transformation a properly fitting dress had wrought. The pale yellow muslin with its delicate eyelet trim highlighted the golden undertones in her fair hair, which I'd arranged in 2 neat braids tied with matching ribbon. No longer did she appear as a faded shadow of herself, shrunken within 2 small dresses. At 10, the first hints of the young woman she would become had begun to emerge, especially now that regular meals and outdoor activity had brought healthy color to her cheeks. Sarah, I said softly, you look beautiful. A flush of pink brightened her face, and though she didn't smile, her eyes conveyed pleasure at the compliment. Timothy, less restrained, circled his sister with undisguised admiration. You're pretty as a picture book, he declared. Even prettier than Miss Fanny's china doll. Before Sarah could respond, not that she would have spoken, though her expressions had become increasingly communicative over the past months, Elijah's voice called from downstairs. Wagon's ready whenever you are, he announced. Need to head out soon if we want decent parking space. The children clattered down the stairs ahead of me, eager to display their finery. I followed more sedately, suddenly self-conscious in my dress, a deep green cotton with white piping that I'd altered to better suit current fashions. It wasn't new, but with fresh collar and cuffs it presented a respectable appearance. Elijah waited at the foot of the stairs, freshly shaved and dressed in his Sunday best. He'd had his hair trimmed yesterday, and the absence of the shaggy locks that usually fell across his forehead made him appear younger, less careworn. His eyes widened slightly as the children presented themselves for inspection. "Well now," he said, crouching to Timothy's level, "who's this fine young gentleman? Can't be my Timothy, he's just a little feller." Timothy giggled, twirling to show off his outfit. "It's me, Pa. Miss Grace made us new clothes." Elijah's gaze shifted to Jacob, who stood straighter under his father's attention. "And look at you, spruced up like a store window mannequin." He ruffled Jacob's neatly combed hair, his pride evident despite the casual gesture. When he turned to Sarah, his expression softened further. "You're the very picture of your—" He stopped, swallowing once before continuing. "You look lovely, Sarah." Finally his eyes found mine as I reached the bottom of the stairs. Something flickered in their blue depth, surprise, appreciation, and perhaps something warmer that sent a flutter through my chest. "You've worked miracles," he said quietly. "Hardly miracles," I demurred. "Just needle and thread, and growing children who needed clothes that fit properly." "More than that," he insisted, his gaze encompassing all four of us. "Much more." The moment stretched between us, weighted with unspoken recognition of how far we'd come since that awkward first meeting, how the forced proximity of our arrangement had gradually transformed into something that felt uncomfortably like a real family. Timothy broke the spell, tugging at his father's hand. "Can we go now? I want to see them build the barn." "Right you are," Elijah agreed, helping me into my light shawl before ushering everyone outside to the waiting wagon. The children climbed in back, Timothy chattering excitedly about barn raisings he'd never actually witnessed. Elijah offered his hand to help me onto the front seat, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. When he settled beside me, I was acutely aware of his nearness. The clean scent of shaving soap, the way his sleeve occasionally brushed mine as he handled the reins. As our wagon rolled down the lane toward the main road, I glanced back at the three children. Jacob pointing at a hawk circling overhead, Timothy bouncing with excitement, Sarah sitting quietly but with an alertness that had been absent when I first arrived. Something tightened in my chest at the sight. Pride, affection, and a possessive tenderness I had no right to feel. "They've changed," Elijah said softly, following my gaze. "All of them." "Because of you." "Because they were ready," I corrected. "They just needed time and stability. And someone who cared enough to see who they really are," he added. "Not just who they were expected to be." I had no response to that, so I simply smoothed my skirts and turned my attention to the passing landscape, trying to ignore the warmth that bloomed in my chest at his words, and the uncomfortable awareness that in less than 2 months, I was scheduled to leave for San Francisco and my teaching position. The Jenkins homestead came into view, already bustling with activity. At least 24 wagons were parked in the adjacent field, and the framework of a new barn had already begun to rise against the clear summer sky. Men in shirt sleeves climbed over the skeleton of beams, shouting instructions and good-natured insults to one another. "Pa, look how high they are!" Jacob exclaimed, his voice carrying over the wagon's rumble. "Can I help climb up there?" "Ground crew for you this time," Elijah replied firmly. "Plenty of important work that doesn't involve tempting fate with those 2 arms of yours." As we drew closer, heads turned to observe our arrival. I felt the weight of curious stares, some merely interested, others clearly assessing the Blackwell family and its newest member. Elijah parked the wagon among the others and helped me down, his hand strong and steady around my waist. As the children gathered around us, Sarah unexpectedly slipped her small hand into mine, a public gesture of acceptance she'd never before offered. The simple touch affected me more deeply than I could have anticipated. I squeezed her fingers gently, receiving a slight pressure in return that spoke volumes from this silent child. "Elijah Blackwell," called a burly man approaching from the barn frame. "Thought you might not make it. Bring those strong arms over here. We need another man on the pulley system." "Be right there, John," Elijah called back before turning to us. "Will you be all right with the children while I help with the raising?" "Of course," I assured him. "We'll join the other women setting up the dinner tables." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the tableau we presented. Me with Sarah's hand in mine, Timothy clutching my skirts, Jacob standing tall beside his sister. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that made my heart beat a curious rhythm. "Blackwell!" Another man approached, slapping Elijah on the shoulder. "About time you got here! And this must be the new Mrs. Blackwell we've been hearing about." He extended his hand to me. "Frank Miller. My wife Beatrice speaks highly of you from church gatherings." "A pleasure, Mr. Miller," I replied, accepting his handshake. "You're a lucky man, Elijah," Frank continued with a wink. "Pretty as a picture, and from what my Beatrice says, good with those youngsters of yours, too." I tensed, waiting for Elijah's correction, the habitual distancing he maintained when our arrangement was mentioned directly, but to my surprise, he simply smiled, his hand coming to rest lightly at the small of my back. "Luckier than I deserve," he replied. And though the words were conventional, the look he gave me contained something that made my breath catch. Not pretense, but genuine appreciation that confused and thrilled me in equal measure. "Pa," Jacob interrupted, oblivious to the undercurrents between adults, "can I go help carry the small boards? John Jr. said they need boys my size to fit in the tight spaces." Elijah nodded, breaking our shared gaze. "Stay where I can see you," he instructed. "And no climbing, mind." As Jacob darted off and Elijah excused himself to join the men, I guided Timothy and Sarah toward the cluster of women organizing the dinner preparations. Yet I couldn't help looking back, catching Elijah in conversation with several other ranchers who gestured toward me and the children with approving nods. His automatic denial, the careful correction that I wasn't truly his wife, never came. Instead, I saw him accept their congratulations with a half smile that suggested he'd begun to wonder, as I had, if our pretense might contain more truth than either of us had bargained for. "More lemonade, Mr. Henderson?" I offered, pitcher in hand as I circulated among the thirsty workers during their mid-morning break. "Much obliged, Mrs. Blackwell," the older rancher replied, extending his cup. "Building barns works up a powerful thirst." I poured carefully, then paused as I noticed two men in city attire, standing slightly apart from the workers. Their suits and polished boots marked them as businessmen rather than ranchers, and their lowered voices carried a conspiratorial note that piqued my curiosity. "Been systematically underpaying every rancher in the county," the taller man was saying. "Harrington knows most of these men are overextended after the harsh winter. They can't afford to wait for better offers." The name sent a jolt through me. Harrington? The cattle broker whose contract I'd found among Elijah's papers. "Shameful business practices," the second man agreed, shaking his head, "offering 30% below market value to men desperate enough to take whatever they can get. Precisely why I've come from Helena," the first man replied. "Clayton Reed Livestock pays fair market prices guaranteed, but breaking Harrington's hold on this region won't be easy. Most ranchers have already signed contracts for fall delivery." I moved closer, under the pretense of collecting empty cups, my heart racing with confirmation of what I'd suspected since finding those papers. Elijah was being cheated by a man who preyed on struggling ranchers. "Mrs. Blackwell," called Mrs. Jenkins from the food tables, "could you bring that pitcher over here? The men are coming in for dinner." Reluctantly, I moved away from the conversation, my mind racing. Thomas's reply to my letter hadn't yet arrived, but these overheard comments confirmed my worst fears about Elijah's financial situation and presented a possible solution in the form of this Clayton Reed from Helena. Throughout dinner, I observed the two businessmen, noting when they approached various ranchers for quiet conversations. They never spoke with Elijah, however, and I realized they likely didn't know which ranchers had already signed with Harrington. As the barn raising continued into the afternoon, I found an opportunity to approach the taller man, Mr. Reed himself, as I'd learned from the church lady's gossip, while he refreshed himself at the water barrel. "Wonderful progress on the barn today," I commented, filling a dipper for Timothy, who hovered at my side. "Indeed, ma'am," he agreed politely, community spirit at its finest. "I understand you're in the cattle business," I ventured, offering the dipper to Timothy before meeting Reed's gaze directly. "My husband mentions that markets have been unpredictable lately." Reed studied me with new interest. Your husband would be? Elijah Blackwell, I replied, gesturing toward where Elijah worked with a team raising a massive support beam. Ah, Reed nodded, his expression revealing nothing. Yes, markets are challenging this season. Some buyers are taking advantage of the situation. How unfortunate, I murmured, especially for ranchers who might not realize they're being offered below market rates. Reed's eyebrows rose slightly, recognizing my deliberate prompting. Mrs. Blackwell, if your husband has concerns about his current arrangements, I'd be happy to discuss alternatives. That's very kind, I replied carefully, aware I was overstepping my bounds but unable to ignore the opportunity. I believe he might be interested, though pride sometimes prevents men from admitting when they've been misled. A smile ghosted across Reed's features. I understand completely. Should Mr. Blackwell wish to discuss options, I'll be at the Pinecrest Hotel until Wednesday. He extracted a business card from his jacket. Perhaps you might mention my name. I accepted the card, slipping it into my pocket as Timothy tugged at my skirt, bored with adult conversation. As we moved away, I caught Reed watching me with thoughtful consideration. A woman involving herself in business matters typically reserved for men. The question now was whether to share this information with Elijah, and how he might receive such intervention from a woman he'd hired simply to care for his children and home. And the first place ribbon for Best Pie goes to... Reverend Thomas paused dramatically, building suspense as the crowd gathered for the 4th of July church picnic, leaned forward in anticipation. Mrs. Grace Blackwell, for her cinnamon apple pie. A smattering of applause broke out as I rose from our family's blanket, genuinely surprised, despite having used my mother's never-fail recipe. I'd entered the contest on impulse, not mentioning it to Elijah or the children in case my baking proved embarrassing. Well done, Grace, called Mrs. Miller, while several other women offered congratulations tinged with the competitive spirit that infused such competitions. As I accepted the blue ribbon and the small envelope containing the $3 prize, Reverend Thomas added, Mrs. Blackwell's winning pie has brought us $5 closer to our new church bell fund. Congratulations! Returning to our blanket beneath a sprawling cottonwood, I found 3 children bursting with pride and Elijah watching me with a bemused expression. You didn't tell us you entered the contest, he said as I settled beside him on the red and white checked cloth. I wasn't certain my mother's recipe would translate to a Montana kitchen, I admitted. It was something of an experiment. A successful one, he observed, glancing at the ribbon. The children have been singing your praises as a baker for months, but I didn't realize I was living with a blue ribbon pie maker. The casual reference to living with sent a flush of warmth to my cheeks that had nothing to do with the July sunshine. These moments of domestic intimacy had become increasingly common and increasingly unsettling as my departure date loomed ever closer. Can we have the prize money for candy? Timothy asked, eyeing the envelope with unconcealed interest. Timothy, Elijah admonished. That's Miss Grace's money. She earned it fair and square. Actually, I interjected, I thought we might use it for new fishing line and hooks. I recall someone mentioning the old ones were worn out. Jacob's eyes widened. Really? You'd spend your prize money on fishing gear? Our family could use a good trout dinner, I replied with deliberate casualness. And I've never been fishing myself. Perhaps you boys could teach me. The reference to our family slipped out unintentionally, but neither Elijah nor the children seemed to notice. Or, if they did, they found nothing unusual in the phrasing. That perhaps was most telling of all. How naturally we'd begun to think of ourselves as a unit, despite the temporary nature of our arrangement. Later that evening, after we'd returned home and the children were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table, counting the household money saved in a crockery jar on the highest pantry shelf. The $3 from my pie victory joined the careful accumulation of pennies and nickels I'd managed to save through household economies. It wasn't much, but combined with the small sum I'd set aside from my monthly salary, it provided a modest cushion against emergencies. Such precautions had become second nature since discovering the ranch's precarious financial position, a position Elijah still didn't know I was aware of. I decided not to mention Clayton Reed's business card, which remained hidden in my dresser drawer, alongside Thomas's as yet unopened reply. The timing hadn't felt right, not during a community celebration with the children present. Tomorrow, perhaps, when we could speak privately. As I returned the jar to its shelf, I heard Elijah's footsteps on the back porch. He entered quietly, hat in hand, having completed his evening check of the livestock. "Still awake?" he asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. "Thought you'd be tired after all the excitement today." "Just tidying up," I replied, unnecessarily straightening items on the counter to avoid his gaze. "That was a fine thing you did," he said, moving closer. "Putting your prize money in the household jar. I saw you." I looked up, caught in my private gesture of commitment to this family that wasn't truly mine. "It's only fair," I managed. "I use the household supplies for baking. The money belongs to the household." "No," he said gently. "By rights, it's yours. Your recipe. Your work." "Our flour, our apples from the cellar, our wood stove," I countered. "A collaborative effort, really." A smile tugged at his lips. "Always have to have the last word, don't you?" "Not always," I protested, then caught the irony and laughed softly. "Well, perhaps sometimes." He chuckled, the warm sound filling the kitchen and my heart simultaneously. These moments of easy companionship had become precious to me, and dangerous in their very comfort. They made it too easy to forget the temporary nature of my position. Too tempting to imagine permanence where none was promised. "I've been meaning to ask," Elijah said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Your teaching position in San Francisco. When exactly do you need to leave?" The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through my manufactured contentment. "Late August," I replied, the words sticking in my suddenly dry throat. "The term begins September 1st. He nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "That's what I recalled. Less than 2 months, then." "Yes." The syllable emerged strangled, inadequate. "The children will miss you," he said quietly. "We've become accustomed to your presence." The deliberate distance in his phrasing, accustomed to your presence, rather than the simpler, more dangerous "miss you," told me he too recognized the perilous territory we approached. "I've grown quite fond of them as well," I replied, matching his careful tone while avoiding the more complicated truth that my feelings extended beyond the children to encompass their father as well. He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back, restoring the proper distance between employer and employee that had gradually eroded over the months. "Good night, Grace," he said finally. "Congratulations again on your victory." As he disappeared up the stairs, I remained in the kitchen, the blue ribbon clutched in my hand, wondering why an achievement that had brought such pleasure hours ago now felt hollow in the face of my impending departure from the family I'd come to love. The letter, when it finally arrived, was thicker than I'd expected. Thomas's handwriting, neat and precise as the man himself, covered 3 full pages of expensive stationery, far more than required to answer my simple inquiry about cattle broker James Harrington. I sat on the garden bench beneath the apple tree, the children occupied with afternoon lessons supervised by Sarah, who had taken to helping Timothy with his letters. The privacy allowed me to break the seal with trembling fingers, uncertain what emotions might be stirred by correspondence from the man who had once promised to be my husband. "My dear Grace, your letter arrived at a most opportune time, as I had been contemplating reaching out to you these past weeks. First, allow me to address your inquiry regarding the cattle broker James Harrington. Your instincts serve you well. Harrington has developed a reputation in banking circles for unscrupulous business practices, particularly in Montana territory. He systematically offers well below market value, targeting ranchers with limited options due to distance from larger markets or financial constraints. Current fair prices for Montana cattle range between $18 per head depending on quality and age. If your employer is receiving substantially less, he is indeed being taken advantage of. I've taken the liberty of enclosing the business card of Clayton Reed, a livestock broker from Helena with an impeccable reputation. Reed pays fair market value and has recently expanded his operation into your region specifically to counter Harrington's monopolistic practices. Now, to more personal matters. I skimmed the remainder quickly, a tangle of apologies and justifications for our broken engagement that held little interest for me now. The man who had once occupied my thoughts and heart now seemed a distant figure, his abandonment a fortunate escape rather than the devastating blow it had appeared at the time. What mattered was the confirmation about Harrington and the coincidental recommendation of Clayton Reed, the very man I'd spoken with at the barn raising. This could not be mere chance, but providence. The question remained, how to share this information with Elijah without revealing I'd been investigating his financial affairs behind his back. Before I could consider further, Timothy came racing around the corner of the house, waving a yellow telegram form. "Miss Grace, a telegram came for you," he announced, thrusting the paper into my hands. "Pa said to bring it right away, 'cause it might be important." I hastily folded Thomas's letter into my pocket and accepted the telegram, my heart racing at the unexpected communication. Telegrams seldom brought good news. "Arriving Saturday, stop. Need to discuss your plans, stop. Matthew." I read the brief message twice. Relief replacing anxiety. "Just Matthew, coming for a visit," though his reference to your plans suggested he expected a decision regarding my future. Would I honor my commitment to the school in San Francisco, or had I found reasons to remain in Montana territory? The question that had lurked in the shadows of my mind for weeks now demanded an answer, complicated by emotions I'd never anticipated when agreeing to this arrangement. "Is it bad news?" Timothy asked, his small face creased with concern. "Not at all," I assured him, tucking the telegram into my pocket alongside Thomas's letter. "Your Uncle Matthew is coming to visit this weekend." "Hooray!" Timothy cheered, already racing back toward the house. "I'll tell Pa and Jacob and Sarah." I remained on the bench, contemplating what Matthew's arrival might mean. He would immediately sense the changed dynamics between Elijah and me, the careful distance we maintained in private moments, belied by the unconscious intimacy of shared glances and casual touches accumulated over months of shared life. More concerning was the imminent decision about my future. The school in San Francisco would need confirmation soon, yet with each passing day, the thought of leaving the Blackwell Ranch, leaving these children, leaving Elijah, felt increasingly impossible to contemplate. When I returned to the house, I found Elijah in the kitchen, reading the telegram I'd left on the table. "Matthew's coming," he said, looking up as I entered. "This Saturday." "Yes," I confirmed, moving to the sink to wash garden soil from my hands. "It will be nice to see him again." Elijah nodded, still studying the telegram. "Need to discuss your plans," he read aloud. "I suppose he's wondering about San Francisco." The directness of his comment startled me. We'd carefully avoided discussing my departure since our brief exchange after the 4th of July picnic. "I imagine so," I agreed, drying my hands on a dish towel to hide their slight trembling. "The school will need confirmation soon." "And have you decided," he asked, his voice carefully neutral, "about your plans?" I turned to face him, caught in the impossible space between duty and desire. "I made a commitment," I said finally, "before I ever came here." He nodded once, his expression revealing nothing. "Of course, you've always been a woman of your word." The simple statement, intended as a compliment, twisted something in my chest. A woman of my word. Yet here I stood, contemplating breaking a professional commitment because my heart had become entangled with a family I'd been hired to assist temporarily. "Matthew's visit comes at a good time," Elijah continued, his tone deliberately lighter. "We should discuss arrangements for after your departure. The children have become accustomed to certain routines. The careful phrasing, arrangements, accustomed routines maintain the fiction that my leaving would be merely a practical inconvenience rather than an emotional upheaval for all concerned. Yes, I agreed, matching his detachment, though it cost me dearly. Very practical to plan ahead. Our eyes met briefly across the kitchen, and for a moment I glimpsed the same conflict raging in him that consumed me. Desire warring with duty, heart with honor. Then he looked away, the moment passing like a cloud shadow across a meadow. "I'd better check on the children's lessons," I said, retreating to safer ground. "Timothy was struggling with his letters yesterday." Elijah simply nodded, allowing me the escape we both needed from emotions neither of us was prepared to confront directly. The foreclosure notice arrived on Thursday, a formal declaration from the territorial bank that payment on the second mortgage was overdue, with a stern warning that proceedings would begin within the week if the delinquent amount wasn't received. Elijah wasn't home when the envelope arrived. He'd ridden to the north pasture to check fence lines and wouldn't return until evening. I recognized the bank's insignia immediately, having sorted enough mail to know that such communications never brought good news. I hadn't intended to open it. For all my involvement in household matters, I still respected the boundaries of privacy. But Timothy, helping collect the mail from our weekly delivery, had torn the envelope in his enthusiasm, revealing enough of the heading, "Notice of Foreclosure Proceedings," to send ice through my veins. The amount due wasn't large by some standards, $128 with interest, but represented an insurmountable sum for a cash-strapped ranch operating on credit until the fall cattle sale. A sale that, if conducted through Harrington, would yield far less than needed to clear the debt and sustain the ranch through winter. I sat at the kitchen table, the notice spread before me, calculating figures in my head. My teaching savings, carefully accumulated over 5 years of frugal living, amounted to just over $200, earmarked for establishing myself in San Francisco, but more than sufficient to cover this immediate debt. The decision formed with surprising clarity. I would pay the amount due. Not tell Elijah, not yet. His pride would never allow him to accept such assistance, but quietly settle the debt to prevent the immediate threat of foreclosure. Later, when Clayton Reed provided a fair price for his cattle, Elijah could repay me if his pride demanded it. I justified the decision as protecting my own security. After all, if the ranch was foreclosed upon, my position would end immediately, disrupting my carefully laid plans. But even as I formulated this rationalization, I recognized the deeper truth. I couldn't bear to see this family lose their home, not when I had the means to prevent it. That afternoon, while Sarah supervised her brother's play in the yard, I rode to town alone, explaining my errand as simple shopping for household necessities. At the territorial bank, I approached the teller's window with the foreclosure notice and my savings passbook. "I'd like to pay this outstanding amount," I explained, pushing both documents across the counter. The young clerk examined the notice, then glanced at my passbook with raised eyebrows. "This is the Blackwell Ranch delinquency," he observed. "Are you authorized to make this payment, ma'am?" I straightened my shoulders. "I am Mrs. Blackwell," I stated, the familiar lie coming easily after months of practice. "I believe that authorizes me to attend to family financial matters." He nodded, though his expression suggested mild surprise at a woman handling such business. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwell, the amount due is $128.42, including interest to date." I swallowed hard at surrendering more than half my savings, but signed the withdrawal slip with steady hands. The security of the Blackwell children of Elijah was worth far more than money. "Will you require a receipt?" the clerk asked, as he counted out the bills. "Yes," I replied firmly. "And please note the account as current, with proceedings terminated." As I rode home with the receipt safely tucked in my reticule, a curious lightness filled me, despite the substantial lightening of my savings. The choice had been made not from duty or obligation, but from a deeper place, a place that recognized the Blackwell Ranch as home in a way Boston had never been, and San Francisco likely never would be. The implications of this realization, and what it might mean for my future plans, would have to wait. For now, I had prevented an immediate crisis, buying time for Elijah to secure a better price for his cattle, if I could find the courage to share what I knew about Harrington and Clayton Reed. You've gone and fallen in love with him, haven't you? Matthew's question, blunt and unexpected, caught me entirely off guard as we walked along the creek that bordered the south pasture. He'd arrived that morning ostensibly to visit, but clearly with ulterior motives regarding my future plans. I don't know what you mean, I protested weakly, though the flush rising to my cheeks betrayed me. Matthew snorted, undeceived. Grace Elizabeth Wilkes, you've never been able to lie worth a damn, especially to me. I've been here exactly 4 hours, and I'd have to be blind not to see how you look at Elijah, and how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. I stopped walking, staring unseeing at the clear water rushing over stones worn smooth by time and persistence. It's complicated, Matthew. Love usually is, he agreed, his tone gentler, but that doesn't answer my question. I sighed, acknowledging defeat. I care for him, yes, and for the children. More than I should, given our arrangement. You mean your so-called marriage, Matthew said dryly. The charade that half the county now accepts as gospel truth, by the way. Mrs. Miller cornered me at the general store this morning to tell me what a perfect match my sister and my best friend have made. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, I said, picking up a flat stone and attempting to skip it across the water, a skill Matthew had taught me in childhood. It sank immediately. I was only meant to help until harvest, then continue to San Francisco as planned. Plans change, he observed, selecting his own stone and sending it dancing across the surface in 4 perfect hops. Life happens while we're making other arrangements. That's surprisingly philosophical coming from you, I remarked, attempting to lighten the moment. Aunt Fanny's influence, he admitted with a grin. That old woman has more wisdom in her little finger than most preachers in their entire bodies. His expression sobered. But we're talking about you, Gracie. You're supposed to leave for San Francisco in 5 weeks? Have you written to accept the teaching position formally? I shook my head, admitting aloud what I'd been avoiding in my own thoughts. I keep putting it off. Each time I sit down to write the letter, I find reasons to delay. Because you don't want to go, he concluded. You want to stay here with Elijah and the children? It isn't that simple, I protested. I made a commitment to the school. I have a responsibility. You also have a responsibility to be honest with yourself, he countered. And with Elijah, for that matter. Have you told him how you feel? The very idea sent panic through me. Of course not. Our arrangement was clear from the beginning. Temporary assistance, nothing more. Matthew studied me for a long moment. And you think he still sees it that way? After watching how you've transformed his home, healed his children, brought life back to a place grief had nearly destroyed? He's grateful, I acknowledged, voicing my deepest fear. But gratitude isn't love, Matthew. I won't mistake one for the other, or burden him with feelings he may not return. Gracie, my brother said gently, I've known Elijah Blackwell since we were boys, stealing apples from Old Man Henderson's orchard. I've never seen him look at any woman the way he looks at you. Not even Rebecca, God rest her soul. Matthew, I gasped, scandalized by the comparison. It's the truth, he insisted. What he had with Rebecca was young love that grew into comfortable partnership. What I see between you two is different, deeper somehow, forged through shared hardship rather than youthful passion. I turned away, unable to face the hope his words kindled. Even if that were true, I said carefully. There are practical considerations. Elijah's financial situation is precarious. Matthew's eyebrows rose. You know about that? I found some papers, I admitted, and overheard conversations. The cattle broker he's contracted with, Harrington, is cheating him badly. Most of the small ranchers in the territory Matthew agreed grimly. It's why I suggested that Clayton Reed fellow come through town. He's offering fair prices, but most ranchers are already locked into contracts with Harrington. Including Elijah, I said. I have Reed's card, but I haven't found the right moment to mention it. And now there's the mortgage payment. The what mortgage payment? Matthew asked sharply. Too late, I realized my slip. Nothing, I said quickly. Just ranch business. Grace. Matthew's tone broke to no evasion. What have you done? Under his relentless gaze, I confessed paying the overdue mortgage amount, watching his expression shift from surprise to concern to reluctant admiration. He'll be furious when he finds out, Matthew warned. Elijah's pride is as vast as Montana territory, which is why he won't find out until the crisis has passed, I replied firmly. Once he sells his cattle for a fair price, he can repay me if his pride demands it. Matthew shook his head, though a smile played at the corners of his mouth. You always were stubborn as a mule once your mind was set. He sighed. Just be careful, Gracie. I don't want to see either of you hurt because of misunderstandings or pride. I'll talk to him, I promised, after I've sorted my own feelings about San Francisco. As we walked back toward the house, Matthew placed a protective arm around my shoulders. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think you'd make Elijah a fine wife, a real one, not this temporary arrangement you've been playing at. Those children adore you, and Elijah, well, a blind man could see how he feels. I leaned into my brother's solid strength, allowing myself, just for a moment, to imagine the possibility of staying, of making this pretend family into a real one. The vision was so alluring, so complete, that returning to reality required physical effort. We should head back, I said finally. Sarah's watching the boys, but Timothy can be a handful. Matthew nodded, respecting my need to retreat from emotions too raw for further discussion. As we crested the small rise overlooking the ranch house, I was struck anew by how much the property had transformed since my arrival. Garden flourishing, fences mended, buildings freshly painted. A home renewed, waiting for the final healing that only time and love could bring. I wasn't sure if I should show you, Sarah whispered, the sound of her voice still new enough to startle me. But I think she'd want you to see. We knelt before the carved wooden chest in Sarah's bedroom, the first words she'd spoken to me directly hanging in the air between us, like fragile crystal. She had begun speaking again 3 weeks ago, first to Timothy when she thought they were alone, then to Jacob after his fall, and finally to her father in a moment that had left Elijah speechless with emotion. That she now spoke to me, willingly and without prompting, felt like a precious gift I hardly deserved. Your mother's things? I asked gently, recognizing the chest as Rebecca's, from Elijah's rare mentions of his late wife. Sarah nodded, her slender fingers tracing the roses carved into the lid. Her special things. Her journals. She looked up at me, her blue eyes solemn and assessing. I think you should read them. The significance of this gesture, this trust, was not lost on me. Are you certain? Journals are very private. She wrote them for us, Sarah explained. To remember her by, to know who she was when we get older. Her voice trembled slightly. But I can't. It hurts too much still, and Timothy's too little, and Jacob pretends he doesn't care. I placed my hand gently atop hers on the chest lid. And your father? He doesn't know I found them, she admitted. They were packed away in the attic. I think it hurts him too much too. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. To honor this trust, to handle the precious memories of a woman whose life had ended too soon, whose family I had come to love as my own. I would be honored, I said finally. But only if you're certain this is what you want. Sarah nodded, her decision made. She would have liked you, she said simply, opening the chest to reveal a stack of leather-bound journals nestled among other treasures. A silver hairbrush, dried flowers pressed between tissue, a child's tiny embroidered dress. These are the ones from after we were born, she explained, selecting 3 volumes from the stack, so you can understand. About us. About her. I accepted the journals with reverent hands, understanding the magnitude of what Sarah was sharing, Not just memories of her mother, but permission to know the woman whose absence had shaped this family so profoundly. Later that night, after the household had settled into sleep, I sat in my room with a single lamp burning, the first of Rebecca Blackwell's journals open before me. Her handwriting, neat and flowing, filled pages with observations about her children, her husband, her hopes and fears for their future. April 18, 1868, Sarah lost her first tooth today. She was so proud, carrying it around like a trophy until Elijah convinced her to put it under her pillow for the tooth fairy. Jacob was immediately jealous and tried to pull out one of his own. That boy's determination will either make him governor or get him hanged someday. Elijah just laughs and says he's got Blackwell's stubbornness, but I see my father in him too, that same intensity, that refusal to give in. I turned pages, glimpsing the everyday moments of family life through Rebecca's loving eyes. Her joy in Timothy's birth, her pride in Jacob's first steps, her dreams for Sarah's future, her deep love for Elijah shone through every entry. Not blind adoration, but honest appreciation of his strengths alongside gentle acknowledgement of his flaws. June 30, 1869. Elijah worked himself to exhaustion again, bringing in the hay before the storm. That man would sooner collapse than admit he needs help, stubborn as the day is long. But when he finally came in, filthy and stumbling with fatigue, he still stopped to kiss each child and bring me the first wild roses of summer. His heart is as vast as his pride, which I suppose is why I love him, despite his maddening self-reliance. Reading her words felt like meeting a friend I would never know in person. A woman of humor, intelligence, and remarkable insight. I found myself smiling at her descriptions of Jacob's childhood mischief, nodding in recognition at her gentle exasperation with Elijah's stubborn pride, blinking back tears at her hopes for the children's futures. In the final journal written during the months before her death, Rebecca's entries grew shorter but more profound, as if aware she might be running out of time. January 15, 1870. Strange to feel so tired when I've done so little today. Dr. Wilson says it's just winter blues, but something feels different this time. If I should follow Mother sooner than expected, I pray the children will remember how very much I loved them. And Elijah, my dearest love, who believes he must carry every burden alone, I pray he would find someone strong enough to share his load, wise enough to respect his pride, and loving enough to heal what breaking my heart will do to his. The last entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, contained a line that made my hands tremble. February 2, 1870. If love is the greatest gift we can offer, then I have lived abundantly. I only pray that when I am gone, love will find its way back to this house, to these children, to my beloved Elijah, not to place what we have shared, but to build something new from the foundation we laid together. I closed the journal, pressing it to my heart as tears slipped down my cheeks. In those pages, I had found not a rival for Elijah's affections, but an ally who had loved her family enough to wish them future happiness, even knowing she wouldn't be part of it. The gift Sarah had given me was more precious than she could have known, not just insight into the mother she'd lost, but permission of a sort to love the family Rebecca had left behind. The summer storm descended with startling quickness, transforming a pleasant afternoon into a housebound evening as rain lashed against windows and wind howled around eaves. Matthew, whose planned departure had been delayed by the weather, helped Elijah secure the barn, while I organized indoor activities for 3 disappointed children who'd been promised fishing at the creek. We can build a fort instead, I suggested, helping them arrange chairs and blankets in the parlor, and I'll make popcorn for our adventure. Timothy's enthusiasm proved contagious, and soon all 3 children were engrossed in constructing an elaborate shelter of blankets, cushions, and strategically placed furniture. I slipped away to the kitchen to prepare the promised treat, smiling at the sounds of cooperation and laughter drifting from the parlor. By the time Elijah and Matthew returned, soaked despite their oilskins, the children had created a magnificent fort and were contentedly playing checkers inside its fabric walls. I handed each man a towel as they shed their wet outer garments in the kitchen. "Quite the architects you've got there," Matthew commented, nodding toward the parlor as he dried his hair. "Miss Grace said we could have popcorn inside the fort," Timothy announced, poking his head out from between blankets. "And tell stories about adventures. Did she now?" Elijah asked, his eyes finding mine with a warmth that belied his damp, bedraggled state. "Sounds like quite an evening planned." "You and Uncle Matthew can join us," Timothy offered magnanimously. "There's room if you squeeze." "Better get that popcorn started first," I suggested, turning toward the stove to hide the flush that rose to my cheeks at the thought of squeezing into close quarters with Elijah. "Timothy, would you like to help me count kernels?" As Timothy scrambled from the fort to join me, I became aware of Elijah watching us, his expression softer than usual, almost wistful. When our eyes met briefly, something passed between us. Unspoken acknowledgement of how naturally we'd fallen into these domestic patterns. How right it felt despite our temporary arrangement. The moment broke when Jacob called from the fort, demanding adjudication of a disputed checker move. Elijah moved to settle the disagreement, leaving Matthew and me in the kitchen preparing popcorn and cider. "Quite the happy family scene," Matthew murmured, too low for the children to hear. "It's just a rainy day activity," I demurred, though we both knew it was far more. An hour later, all 6 of us were somehow accommodated within the blanket fort, sharing popcorn and taking turns telling increasingly outlandish adventure stories. Timothy sat in my lap, while Sarah leaned comfortably against my side. Jacob had claimed the spot beside his uncle, leaving Elijah sitting across from me, our knees occasionally brushing in the confined space. "And then the pirate captain discovered the treasure wasn't gold at all," Jacob was saying, gesturing dramatically, "but a map to an even bigger treasure hidden in a cave full of bones." "Very frightening," I praised, laughing at his enthusiasm. "What happened next?" As Jacob continued his tale, I became aware of Elijah watching me, rather than his son. When I glanced his way, he didn't look away as he might have once, but held my gaze with an intensity that made my heart skip. In the soft lamplight filtering through the blankets, surrounded by children's laughter, something unguarded and tender filled his expression, something he no longer seemed concerned about hiding. Matthew noticed too. As Jacob's story concluded with improbable heroics and vast riches, my brother stretched elaborately and turned to Elijah. "Think that rain's letting up? We should check the barn again. Make sure that leak near the hay storage isn't causing trouble." "I checked it thoroughly before we came in," Elijah replied, clearly confused by the suggestion. "Better safe than sorry," Matthew insisted, already crawling toward the fort's entrance. "Won't take but a minute." Understanding dawned on Elijah's face. Matthew was manufacturing an excuse for private conversation. With a slight nod, he followed my brother out of the fort, pausing only to ruffle Timothy's hair and instruct the children to mind Miss Grace. As they donned their still damp coats and stepped onto the back porch, I tried to focus on Sarah's quieter, more thoughtful story about a lost fawn finding its way home. But my thoughts followed the men into the rain, wondering what Matthew might be saying and how Elijah would respond. In the barn, sheltered from the downpour by solid timber walls, Matthew wasted no time with pretense. "What are your intentions toward my sister?" he asked bluntly, watching Elijah check the supposedly worrisome leak that was, in fact, completely secured. Elijah's hand stilled on the rafter he'd been inspecting. "That's mighty direct, even for you, Matthew." "Situation calls for directness," Matthew replied, leaning against a stall door. "Grace is supposed to leave for San Francisco in a month, but anyone with eyes can see she's torn. And I'm guessing you're the reason why." Elijah descended the ladder slowly, buying time to order his thoughts. "Your sister has been a godsend to my family," he said carefully. "The children adore her." "And you?" Matthew pressed. "How do you feel about her?" Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "What I feel doesn't much matter. She has plans, a teaching position waiting, a future in San Francisco far better than anything a struggling widower with 3 children could offer." "That's not what I asked," Matthew said quietly. "How do you feel about her, Elijah?" For a long moment, the only sound was rain drumming on the barn roof and the occasional stomping of horses in their stalls. Then, with a defeated slump of his shoulders, Elijah met his friend's gaze directly. "I love her," he admitted, the words emerging rough and unpolished. "More than I thought possible after Rebecca. Different, but just as real." He shook his head. "But I've got no right to ask her to stay, to give up opportunities for a man who can barely keep his ranch afloat, who comes with the responsibility of 3 children." "Seems to me," Matthew observed, "those 3 children might be exactly why she'd consider staying. She loves them too." "Out of kindness," Elijah insisted. "Grace is the most compassionate woman I've ever known. She never abandoned children who needed her." "Is that what you think this is, compassion?" Matthew's tone sharpened. "My sister isn't some self-sacrificing saint, Elijah. She's a flesh and blood woman who's fallen in love with you and those children, against her better judgment and despite all her careful plans." Elijah stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "She told you that?" "Not in so many words," Matthew admitted. "But I've known Grace all her life. I've never seen her look at anyone the way she looks at you, not even that banking fellow in Boston she nearly married." "She deserves better," Elijah said stubbornly. "A man who can give her security, comfort." "She deserves to make her own choice," Matthew countered, "without you making assumptions about what's best for her." Elijah paced the length of the barn, agitation evident in every movement. "The ranch is in trouble, Matthew. Worse than you know. That cattle contract with Harrington is going to leave me short on the banknote come September. I could lose everything." "And you think Grace doesn't know that?" Matthew shook his head. "My sister is many things, but naive isn't one of them. She sees more than you realize." "Even so," Elijah insisted, "I can't ask her to tie herself to a sinking ship." "Then don't," Matthew said simply. "Fix the ship. Break the contract with Harrington. There are other buyers who'll pay fair prices." "And the penalties for breaking the contract? Where would that money come from?" Matthew smiled enigmatically. "You might be surprised what resources are available when a determined woman sets her mind to something." Elijah's retort was interrupted by a small sneeze from behind a stack of hay bales. Both men turned toward the sound as Timothy emerged, looking sheepish, but determined. "Timothy," Elijah exclaimed, "what are you doing in here? You're supposed to be in the house with Miss Grace." "I followed you," the boy admitted, "to see if you were really checking for leaks." His small face scrunched with confusion. "But you're just talking about Miss Grace." Elijah and Matthew exchanged alarmed glances, wondering how much the child had overheard. "Timothy," Elijah began carefully, "it's not polite to listen to private conversations." "I know," Timothy admitted, scuffing his boot against the barn floor. "But I heard you say you love Miss Grace. For real, not just pretend for town." Elijah closed his eyes briefly, mentally calculating the damage control needed. "Timothy, I knew it!" the boy exclaimed, his face lighting with triumph. "I told Jacob you did, but he said it was just for the church ladies." Without warning, he turned and darted toward the barn door. "I gotta tell Miss Grace." "Timothy, wait!" Elijah called, lunging after his son, but the nimble 4-year-old had already squeezed through the door and was racing toward the house, through the rain, small boots splashing through puddles with each determined step. "Hell's bells," Elijah muttered, torn between pursuit and the knowledge that he'd never catch the boy before he reached the house. And Grace. Matthew's laughter, rich and unrestrained, echoed through the barn. "Looks like your hand's been forced, my friend. Better decide what you're going to say to my sister when she hears your declaration second-hand from a 4-year-old. Elijah stared at his friend in horror, imagining Grace's reaction to Timothy's breathless announcement. Then, to Matthew's surprise, a slow smile spread across his face. The first genuine, unguarded smile he'd worn in longer than he could remember. "Maybe it's fitting," he said softly. "The children brought her into our lives. Perhaps they should be the ones to tell her she's welcome to stay." As they watched through the rain-streaked window, Timothy burst into the house, screen door slamming behind him. Within moments, he would deliver his momentous news to Grace, setting in motion events neither man could predict or control. "Courage, my friend," Matthew said, clapping Elijah on the shoulder. "Whatever happens next, at least it won't be dull." Elijah nodded. squaring his shoulders as they prepared to face whatever awaited them inside. And the woman whose answer would determine the future of the Blackwell family. Chapter 6: The Breaking Point. I was kneading bread dough when I heard the unfamiliar wagon approaching, the steady clop of hooves and creak of well-oiled wheels drawing me to the kitchen window. A smart buggy pulled by a matched pair of bays rolled to a stop in our yard, far too fine a conveyance for any of our neighbors. My hands, dusted with flour, stilled on the mound of dough as a well-dressed gentleman descended, straightening his suit jacket with practiced ease. Elijah emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached the visitor. From my vantage point, I could see the wariness in his posture, the slight stiffening of his shoulders that betrayed his discomfort with unexpected company. I recognized the visitor immediately, Clayton Reed, the cattle buyer from Helena, whose business card had remained hidden in my dresser drawer since the barn raising. A flutter of panic rose in my chest. I'd written to Mr. Reed last week, inquiring about current prices and the possibility of breaking Elijah's contract with Harrington, but hadn't expected him to appear in person without warning. The timing couldn't have been worse, with tension still lingering in the household following Timothy's innocent announcement of Elijah's feelings Elijah himself had neither confirmed nor denied in the awkward days since. Unable to hear their conversation from the house, I hurriedly covered the dough with a damp cloth and wiped my hands on my apron. Propriety demanded I offer refreshments to a guest, however unexpected. By the time I'd arranged a tray with coffee and the last of yesterday's cinnamon rolls, the men had moved to the shade of the front porch. I emerged just as their conversation reached a critical point. $20 per head is my standard offer for prime cattle, Mr. Reed was saying, consulting a small notebook. After reviewing your herd count and the quality you described, I'm prepared to contract for the entire lot at that price. Elijah's expression betrayed his shock, though he quickly schooled his features. That's considerably higher than the current offer I'm considering. Harrington's offer, you mean, Reed replied, accepting the coffee I extended with a polite nod. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell. As I was saying, Harrington consistently underpays by 20 to 30%. It's how he's built his business, exploiting ranchers with limited options. Elijah's gaze flickered to me at Reed's use of my supposed married name, a question forming in his eyes. Mighty coincidental that you'd appear at my ranch with this offer, he observed, his tone carefully neutral. Especially since I don't recall soliciting your business. Reed sipped his coffee, regarding Elijah over the rim of his cup. Not coincidental at all, Mr. Blackwell. I've been reaching out to ranchers throughout the region after hearing about Harrington's practices. Your wife was kind enough to correspond with me regarding your situation. The cup in Elijah's hand stilled halfway to his lips. My wife, he repeated, his voice flat. An uncomfortable silence descended as Reed glanced between us, clearly sensing the sudden tension. Indeed, Mrs. Blackwell expressed concern about your current arrangement with Harrington. Given what she described, I felt a personal visit was warranted. I met Elijah's gaze directly, refusing to flinch from the storm gathering in his blue eyes. Mr. Reed's reputation for fair dealings is well established, I said evenly. It seemed prudent to explore all options before the fall sale. Something dangerous flickered across Elijah's features before he turned back to Reed with a tight smile that never reached his eyes. I appreciate your interest, Mr. Reed. However, I'm already contracted with Harrington for the season's sale. A common situation, Reed acknowledged, which is why I'm prepared to cover any penalties for breaking that contract, provided you sign with me instead. Based on your herd size, you'd still come out significantly ahead. Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained remarkably steady. That's a generous offer. I'll need time to consider it. Of course, Reed extracted a document from his breast pocket. My formal offer, including terms and conditions. I'll be in town until Friday if you have questions. He rose, gathering his hat. I should be on my way. Other ranchers to see before nightfall. I accompanied the men to the yard, maintaining a composed expression despite the tension crackling before a storm. The moment Reed's buggy disappeared around the bend, Elijah turned to me, fury and betrayal etched in every line of his face. "Get inside," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now." I preceded him into the house, chin high despite the trepidation coiling in my stomach. In the kitchen, the bread dough had risen, spilling over the edges of the bowl in blissful ignorance of the confrontation about to erupt. Elijah closed the door with deliberate care, then faced me across the kitchen table, Reed's contract clutched in his fist. "Would you care to explain," he asked with deceptive calm, "why a cattle buyer from Helena believes you're my wife and feels entitled to interfere in my business affairs?" "I didn't claim to be your wife," I replied, forcing steadiness into my voice. That was his assumption based on our arrangement. As for interfering, I merely inquired about fair market prices after learning Harrington has been systematically cheating ranchers throughout the territory. "And how exactly," Elijah demanded, his control slipping, "did you come by this information about my private business dealings?" I squared my shoulders, refusing to be cowed. "I found your contract with Harrington while organizing the household papers. $15 per head is highway robbery, Elijah. Every source confirms current prices should be at least 20. So you took it upon yourself to contact another buyer?" His voice rose with each word. "To discuss my affairs behind my back? To make me appear incompetent?" "I was trying to help," I protested. "The ranch is struggling financially." "That is not your concern," he thundered, slapping the contract down on the table. "I don't need a woman managing my business or my finances. I certainly don't need your charity or your pity." The accusation stung like a physical blow. "It isn't pity," I insisted. "It's practical assistance from someone who cares about this family's welfare. Someone I hired to teach my children and keep my house," he corrected harshly. "Not to meddle in matters beyond her understanding." My own temper flared at his dismissal. "Beyond my understanding? I've managed household accounts since I was 16. I ran the seminary finances for 2 years before coming here. I understand perfectly well when someone is being swindled." "And what else have you been managing without my knowledge?" he demanded, advancing around the table. "What other aspects of my supposedly incompetent life have you been silently correcting?" The moment had come. There would be no gentle way to reveal what I'd done, not with his pride already wounded and his anger in full blaze. "The mortgage payment," I admitted quietly. "The bank was threatening foreclosure. I paid the overdue amount from my savings." He stared at me as if I'd struck him, color draining from his face. "You what?" $128.42, I specified, watching his expression shift from anger to humiliation. "The notice came while you were checking the north pasture. I couldn't let the ranch be foreclosed upon." "You had no right," he breathed, his voice hollow with shock. "No right whatsoever." "I had every right to protect my own security," I countered, though we both knew my motives ran far deeper. "If the ranch was foreclosed upon, my position would end immediately." "Your position?" he repeated bitterly. "Of course. Your temporary arrangement that you could terminate at any moment." He laughed, a harsh sound utterly devoid of humor. "Here I thought—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. "Thought what?" I pressed, desperate to break through his wounded pride. "It doesn't matter." He turned away, his shoulders rigid. "What matters is that you've overstepped every boundary. You've made me a charity case in my own home." "That was never my intention," I insisted, moving toward him, needing him to understand. "I care about this ranch, about the children." "The children," he interrupted, wheeling back to face me. "Is that what this is about? Saving the poor motherless children from their failing father? Building yourself a ready-made family to manage and correct as you see fit?" I gasped, stung by the unfairness of his accusation. "That's not true. I love those children, and I—" "Paul?" Jacob's voice from the doorway stopped us both cold. He stood there with Sarah and Timothy clustered behind him, their eyes wide with confusion and distress. "Why are you yelling at Miss Grace?" For a moment, neither Elijah nor I spoke, the realization that the children had witnessed our argument washing over us like cold water. "It's nothing for you to worry about," I managed, forcing a calmness I was far from feeling, just a disagreement between adults. "Are you leaving?" Timothy asked, his lower lip trembling. "Uncle Matthew said you might not go to San Francisco." Children, Elijah said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Go outside and play while Miss Grace and I finish our discussion. But, Jacob began. Now, please, I interjected gently. We'll explain everything later. Reluctantly, they retreated, Sarah's worried gaze lingering on me until she followed her brothers onto the porch. As the door closed behind them, I turned back to Elijah, desperate to salvage something from this disaster. They shouldn't have heard that, I said quietly. I'm sorry. As am I, he replied, the anger in his voice replaced by something worse, resignation. It seems I've failed at protecting them too. Elijah. A crash from the porch interrupted me, followed immediately by Timothy's frightened cry. We both rushed toward the door, colliding in our haste. Elijah reached it first, yanking it open to reveal Sarah standing frozen beside the overturned kerosene lamp we kept on the small porch table for evening light. Flames had already caught the dry wood of the porch railing, spreading with alarming speed. Timothy, Jacob, get water, Elijah shouted, grabbing the heavy quilt we used for picnics from its hook by the door. Sarah, step back! I pulled Sarah away from the flames as Elijah beat at the fire with the quilt. Jacob appeared with a bucket from the rain barrel. Timothy stumbled in behind him with a smaller pail. Together they doused the burning railing while I shepherded Sarah to safety. Within minutes the fire was extinguished, leaving a charred section of porch rail and the acrid smell of smoke. Sarah trembled in my arms, her face buried against my shoulder. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice muffled against my dress. I was trying to light it to see better, but my hands were shaking. It's all right, I soothed, stroking her hair. No serious harm done. But as I met Elijah's gaze over her head, we both recognized the metaphorical significance of what had just occurred. Our argument, our pride and hurt feelings, had spilled over to affect the very children we were both trying to protect. The realization seemed to drain the last of Elijah's anger, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. Boys, help me clean up this mess, he said quietly. Sarah, go with Miss Grace and wash your hands. In the kitchen, as I gently cleaned soot from Sarah's fingers, she looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. Are you and Pa fighting because of what Timothy said? About Pa loving you for real? The innocent question nearly undid me. No, sweetheart, I assured her, though it wasn't entirely true. Sometimes adults disagree about important matters. It doesn't mean we don't care for each other. She studied me with a perception far beyond her years. But you're still leaving, aren't you? I hesitated, torn between honesty and comfort. Before I could formulate a response, Elijah appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah, go help your brothers, he said gently. Miss Grace and I need to finish our conversation. When we were alone again, the kitchen seemed unnaturally silent, as if the very walls held their breath in anticipation of what would follow. You were right about Harrington, Elijah said finally, his voice level. I should have investigated other buyers. I was too proud to admit I might have made a poor business decision. The olive branch, tentatively extended, gave me hope that reconciliation might still be possible. I should have spoken to you directly instead of acting behind your back, I acknowledged. That was wrong of me. He nodded, a muscle working in his jaw as he visibly struggled with his next words. The mortgage payment, I'll repay you as soon as I sell the cattle, every cent. There's no hurry, I assured him. I know the ranch's finances will improve with a fair price for the herd. That's not the point. His voice hardened again. I won't be indebted to you or anyone else. I've managed this ranch alone since Rebecca died, and I'll continue to do so. The unspoken message couldn't have been clearer. There was no place for me in that vision of his future. I understand, I said quietly, my heart constricting painfully in my chest. Perhaps it would be best if I accelerated my plans to leave. The fall term in San Francisco begins in just a few weeks. Something flickered across his face. Regret, pain, before his expression shuttered closed. If that's what you think is best. I'll write to confirm my position immediately, I said, each word feeling like a stone laid upon my own grave. And make travel arrangements accordingly. He nodded once, sharply, then turned toward the door. "I need to check the herd in the north pasture. I'll be back by supper." He didn't look back as he strode from the house, his shoulders set in a rigid line that spoke of pride and pain in equal measure. Left alone in the kitchen, I stared at the forgotten bread dough, now collapsed and sour, a fitting metaphor for the hopes that had been rising within me these past months. With mechanical movements, I discarded the ruined dough and began again, forcing back tears that would solve nothing. I had made my decision. Now I would live with it, regardless of the cost to my heart. The letter from the San Francisco Ladies' Seminary arrived 3 days later, confirming my appointment as English and Literature instructor for the fall term, with a request that I arrive by August 20th to prepare my classroom and curriculum. I read the formal acceptance twice, trying to summon the enthusiasm I would have felt just months ago at this opportunity. Instead, I felt only a hollow ache in my chest as I contemplated leaving the Blackwell Ranch, leaving the children who had claimed my heart, leaving Elijah who held it, whether he wanted the responsibility or not. Since our argument, an uneasy truce had settled over the household. Elijah rose before dawn and returned after dark, throwing himself into ranch work with a single-mindedness that left no room for conversation beyond the most basic exchanges. The children watched us with wary eyes, sensing the chasm that had opened between us, but powerless to bridge it. I waited until supper that evening to make my announcement, when the family was gathered around the table in one of our increasingly rare moments together. "I've received confirmation of my teaching position," I said into a lull in the conversation, striving for a lightness I didn't feel. "The term begins earlier than I'd anticipated, so I'll need to leave in 2 weeks." Timothy's fork clattered against his plate. 2 weeks? But that's so soon. "I know, sweetheart," I said gently, avoiding Elijah's gaze across the table. "But they need time to prepare me for the school year." "Can't you teach here instead?" Jacob demanded, his voice cracking with emotion he tried to disguise as annoyance. "Pa could pay you to teach us." "It's not that simple," I began, but Elijah interrupted. "Miss Grace made a commitment to this school long before she came here," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "She's a woman of her word. We've always known this arrangement was temporary." The reminder stung, especially coming from him. "Yes," I agreed quietly, "but I promised to make the most of our remaining time together. We'll continue your lessons, and I'll prepare materials for you to use after I'm gone." Sarah hadn't spoken, but her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with distress. Without a word, she pushed back from the table and fled upstairs, her footsteps echoing her agitation. "I'll go to her," I said, rising, but Elijah shook his head. "Give her time," he advised, his voice gentler than it had been since our argument. "This is difficult for her. For all of them." Our eyes met briefly, and I glimpsed in his the same pain that threatened to overwhelm me. Not just for the children's sake, but for what might have been between us, had pride and misunderstanding not intervened. "I understand," I said softly, though in truth I understood far too little, like why he seemed willing to let me go without a fight, if he truly felt as Timothy had claimed. Later, as I washed dishes alone in the kitchen, I allowed myself the luxury of tears that I'd denied in front of the children. 2 weeks, 14 days until I would board a stagecoach bound for the coast, leaving behind the family who had claimed my heart, as surely as if they had been born to me. The worst part was knowing that Elijah had not denied his feelings, not to Matthew, not even to me directly. He had simply decided that his pride was more important than whatever had grown between us. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps a man who could not accept help, who saw support as charity, was not ready for the partnership marriage demanded. But oh, how my heart argued otherwise. The following days passed in a blur of preparations and increasingly desperate attempts by the children to delay my departure. Timothy complained of mysterious stomach ailments that only my presence could soothe. Jacob suddenly developed an insatiable interest in literature, begging for lessons that would stretch beyond my planned departure. Sarah, still largely silent but more communicative than when I'd arrived, left carefully pressed flowers on my pillow each night, wordless pleas that tore at my resolve. I responded with as much composure as I could muster, maintaining our lessons while gradually introducing the idea that they would continue learning without me. Inside, each day felt like another small death as I contemplated leaving them. Leaving him. Elijah remained distant, though I occasionally caught him watching me with an expression that made my breath catch. Regret mingled with a yearning that mirrored my own. But he never spoke of it, never made any move to bridge the gulf between us. His pride, it seemed, remained intact, though the cost to us both grew more evident with each passing day. A week before my scheduled departure, Jacob's scheme to reunite us reached its desperate climax. As I returned from gathering eggs, a piercing cry from the barn sent me running, heart in my throat. Inside, I found Jacob sprawled in the hay, clutching his leg and moaning piteously. "Jacob, what happened?" I knelt beside him, hands moving instinctively to check for injury. "Fell from the loft again," he gasped, his face contorted with apparent pain. "My leg, I think it's broken." "Don't move," I instructed, though something about his performance struck me as forced. "I'll get your father." "No!" His hand shot out to grasp my wrist. "I mean, he's too far away, in the south pasture. You need to help me, Miss Grace." I studied him more carefully, noting the lack of swelling or bruising on the supposedly injured leg. "Jacob," I said gently, "is your leg really hurt?" His eyes dropped, unable to maintain the deception under direct questioning. "It could have been," he muttered. "I really did fall, just not very far." "Oh, Jacob." I sighed, understanding dawning. "Did you think pretending to be injured would somehow fix things between your father and me?" His face crumpled, boyish bravado giving way to genuine distress. "You can't leave, Miss Grace. Everything's all wrong now. Pa hardly talks, Sarah stopped speaking again, and Timothy cries at night when he thinks no one can hear him." My heart contracted painfully at this evidence of the children's suffering. "I don't want to leave," I admitted quietly. "But sometimes adults have obligations that can't be avoided. You could marry Pa for real," he suggested with a child's directness. "Then you'd have to stay." "Marriage doesn't work that way," I explained gently. "Both people have to want it, to choose it freely." "But Pa does want it," Jacob insisted. "I heard him tell Uncle Matthew he loves you. He's just too stubborn to say it to your face." Despite knowing I shouldn't encourage such talk, I couldn't help asking, "When did you hear this?" "The night of the storm," Jacob admitted. I followed them to the barn after Timothy came back all excited. Pa didn't see me. His expression turned pleading. "He really does love you, Miss Grace. He's just afraid you'll leave anyway." The irony nearly undid me. Elijah feared I would leave, so he pushed me away first, and in doing so, ensured the very outcome he dreaded. "Jacob," I said carefully, "relationships between adults are complicated. Your father and I have misunderstandings that can't be solved by pretending to be injured." He scowled, his scheme unraveling before his eyes. "It was Timothy's idea anyway. Sarah said it wouldn't work, but we had to try something." I helped him to his feet, brushing hay from his clothing. "I appreciate that you care so much," I told him, "but this is something your father and I must resolve ourselves, if it can be resolved at all." As we walked back to the house, Jacob's injury miraculously healed. I couldn't help wondering what other schemes the children might attempt in the week remaining before my departure, and whether any intervention could mend the rift that pride and hurt had opened between Elijah and me. "Drought's setting in early this year," Matthew observed, squinting at the cloudless sky as we sat on the porch 2 days later. He'd arrived that morning, ostensibly to help with preparations for my departure, though I suspected his true purpose was one final attempt at reconciliation. "The creek's already lower than it should be," I agreed, following his gaze to the browning pastures beyond the yard, and the garden struggling despite daily watering. "It's worse in town," he continued. "Simmons' well has gone dry, and the millers are hauling water from the river for their livestock." He paused, glancing sideways at me. Elijah mention any concerns? Elijah and I haven't discussed much of anything lately, I admitted, keeping my voice low to avoid being overheard by the children playing nearby. Matthew sighed, shaking his head. Two of the most stubborn people I've ever known. Both miserable, both too proud to take the first step. He made his feelings quite clear, I said stiffly. My assistance was neither wanted nor appreciated. His pride was hurt, Matthew countered. Doesn't mean his heart wasn't engaged. I turned to face my brother directly. Did he tell you that? He didn't have to. Matthew's expression softened. I've known Elijah since we were boys, Gracie. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Hope fluttered weakly in my chest before I ruthlessly suppressed it. If that were true, he wouldn't be letting me leave without a word. Maybe he thinks that's what you want, Matthew suggested. You did confirm your teaching position the minute things got difficult. Because he made it abundantly clear there was no place for me here, I protested. He said he'd managed alone since Rebecca died and would continue to do so. And you believed him? Matthew raised an eyebrow. The man's drowning in responsibilities, Gracie. The drought will only make things worse. He needs you, whether he can admit it or not. Needing someone isn't the same as loving them, I said quietly, and I won't settle for less than that, not even for the children's sake. Before Matthew could respond, Elijah appeared from the direction of the barn, his expression darkening momentarily at the sight of us in close conversation. Since Matthew's arrival, he'd maintained a careful civility that did nothing to disguise the tension simmering beneath the surface. Matthew, he acknowledged with a nod. Mind if I borrow you? Need help moving some equipment before the weather turns? The excuse was transparent. We'd seen no sign of threatening weather, but Matthew rose willingly enough. Of course. Ladies, if you'll excuse us. As they walked toward the barn, I couldn't help noticing the stiffness in Elijah's posture, the deliberate distance he maintained from my brother. Whatever friendship they'd shared had become another casualty of the rift between us. That evening, after a stilted supper during which Elijah and I carefully avoided direct communication, Matthew made one final attempt at mediation. This drought could be serious, he observed as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of flame. Half the county's already feeling the effects. Creek's still running on our property, Elijah replied, his tone deliberately casual. Should be enough for the cattle through summer. And if it's not, Matthew pressed, you've got 3 hands worth of work and only your own 2 to do it. I tensed, recognizing my brother's strategy. He was attempting to demonstrate Elijah's need for help, my help, in the face of this new challenge. I'll manage, Elijah said flatly, shutting down the implied suggestion. Always have. Doesn't mean you always should, Matthew countered, glancing meaningfully between us. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, Elijah. Sometimes it's wisdom. I appreciate the concern, Elijah replied, rising abruptly. But I need to check on the children. It's getting late. As he disappeared into the house, Matthew turned to me with a frustrated sigh. Stubborn as a Missouri mule, he muttered. Both of you. It's over, Matthew, I said quietly, watching the last crimson streaks fade from the sky. Whatever might have been between us has been buried under too much pride and hurt. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. I don't believe that, my brother insisted. Not with the way he looks at you when your back is turned. Not with how you've transformed this place from a house of mourning to a home again. His words pierced my carefully constructed defenses, releasing tears I'd fought to contain for days. Then why is he letting me go? I whispered, the question that had tormented me since our argument finally finding voice. Matthew wrapped a comforting arm around my shoulders. Because he doesn't believe he deserves happiness, he said simply. Because loving someone means risking loss. And he's already lost too much. I leaned against my brother's solid strength, drawing comfort from his presence as I had since childhood. Then we're at an impasse, I concluded sadly. Because I can't stay where I'm not truly wanted, no matter how much I love this family. Matthew didn't argue further, simply holding me as twilight deepened into night, the stars emerging one by one in the vast Montana sky that would soon no longer be mine to admire. The night before I planned to begin packing my trunks dawned with a sense of finality that weighed upon me like physical exhaustion. I moved through the day in a fog of grief, mechanically completing household tasks while trying to memorize every detail of the home and family I would soon leave behind. Timothy followed me like a shadow, his usual chatter subdued to near silence. Jacob alternated between angry outbursts and desperate pleas for just one more lesson in subjects he'd previously avoided. Sarah watched from a distance, her solemn eyes tracking my movements, as if committing them to memory. Just as I was doing with hers. Elijah remained absent, having ridden out at dawn with a terse explanation about checking water levels in the distant pastures. His absence felt deliberate, a physical manifestation of the emotional withdrawal he'd maintained since our argument. Evening fell without his return. I put the children to bed alone, reading Timothy an extra story, answering Jacob's manufactured questions about literature, and braiding Sarah's hair with particular care. Each routine task felt like a small farewell, another thread severed in the tapestry of family life we had woven together. Later, unable to sleep, I sat at my small desk composing letters for each child, messages of encouragement and affection to sustain them after my departure. For Timothy, I drew small pictures alongside simple words he was learning to read. For Jacob, I created a reading list with notes about books he might enjoy as his skills advanced. For Sarah, I wrote a longer letter acknowledging her progress and courage, expressing my belief in her continued healing. I had just finished sealing Sarah's letter when a soft knock sounded at my door. Surprise. It was well past midnight. I rose to find Sarah herself standing in the hallway, her face streaked with tears, her small body trembling with barely suppressed sobs. "Sarah," I whispered, immediately kneeling to her level. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" For a moment she simply stared at me, her blue eyes swimming with tears. Then, in a voice hoarse from disuse and emotion, she whispered the words that shattered the last of my composure. "Please don't leave us." 4 simple words, the first she had spoken directly to me, crashed through every defense I had constructed around my heart. I gathered her into my arms as her control broke completely, her thin shoulders heaving with sobs too long contained. "Oh, Sarah," I murmured, my own tears falling unchecked into her golden hair. "I don't want to leave you. I love you all so much." "Then stay," she pleaded, her words muffled against my nightdress. "Stay with us, with me, please." I had no answer that wouldn't compound her pain, so I simply held her, rocking gently as I had when Timothy had nightmares or Jacob was ill. Her tears gradually subsided to hiccuping breaths, but her arms remained locked around my neck, as if physical contact alone could prevent our impending separation. "I'm scared," she confessed, in a broken whisper. "Without you, everything will go back to how it was before. Dark and quiet and sad." "Your father loves you very much," I reminded her gently. "He won't let that happen." "But he needs you too," she insisted with a child's certainty. "He's different when you're here. He smiles more. He laughs sometimes." The simple observation held more truth than all Matthew's well-intentioned arguments. Elijah did laugh more now, did smile more often, or had, before our estrangement. The realization only deepened the ache of what I was losing. "Sometimes," I began carefully, "adults make choices that seem wrong to others, even when they're trying to do what's best." "It's not best for you to leave," Sarah stated with unexpected firmness. "It's not best for any of us." Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't involve empty promises, a floorboard creaked in the darkened hallway. Sarah and I both looked up to find Elijah, standing in the shadows, his expression unreadable in the dim light. How long he had been there, what he had overheard, I couldn't guess, but something in his posture suggested a man who had reached the limits of his endurance. "Sarah," he said softly, "it's very late. You should be in bed." "I don't want Miss Grace to go," she told him directly, her newfound voice steady despite her tears. "Please don't make her leave, Pa." The naked plea in her voice seemed to strike Elijah like a physical blow. He moved forward into the pool of lamplight from my room, and I saw with shock that his own face bore traces of emotion too powerful to conceal. "I'm not making Miss Grace leave," he said gently, kneeling beside us. "She has a teaching position waiting. Important work." "Important than us?" Sarah challenged, and the simple question hung in the air between us, demanding an answer none of us could provide. Elijah's eyes met mine over Sarah's head, and in that unguarded moment I glimpsed the full measure of his conflict. Pride warring with need, fear of vulnerability balanced against fear of loss. The wall he had constructed between us seemed to waver, foundations crumbling under the weight of his daughter's tears and his own barely suppressed emotion. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice rough with feeling, "go back to bed now. Miss Grace and I need to talk." Sarah looked between us, hope battling skepticism in her tear-stained face. "Promise you'll really talk, not just say goodbye?" "I promise," Elijah assured her, and something in his tone carried a weight beyond the simple pledge to his daughter. Reluctantly, Sarah released her grip on me and allowed her father to guide her back to her room. I remained kneeling on the floor, my nightdress damp with her tears, my heart suspended between despair and a fragile, newborn hope that perhaps, at the final hour, the walls between us might yet fall. That's the end of part 1. If you're ready for more drama, romance, and shifter magic, part 2 is waiting for you. Find the link in the comments or description below. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next part.